There is a place where the dead were lifted into the sky and left to watch over the living, not buried in the earth, not committed to fire, but sealed inside the face of a cliff 155 feet above the valley floor, in a honeycomb of chambers no human hand could reach without a rope and a reason. When the climbers finally hauled themselves up that sheer wall in the thin air of Upper Mustang, when their headlamps swept across the dust of 1,000 years, they found bodies, preserved, arranged, waiting. And the first question that rose in that dry, cold darkness was the same one that has never been answered, the one that will haunt every step of this journey. Who did this? Who climbed to the roof of the world, into the death zone where the air itself resists life, and carved a civilization into stone that should have killed them? The year was 2010. An interdisciplinary team, led by the archaeologist Mark Aldendifer and the veteran mountaineer Pete Athens, had come to the remote reaches of Upper Mustang in northern Nepal, a wind-scoured desert kingdom pressed against the border of Tibet. Near the small village of Samdzong, at roughly 13,800 feet above sea level, they had found something the modern world had all but forgotten. A funerary cave complex cut into cliffs so fragile, so steep, that time had already stripped away whatever ladders or paths once granted access. To reach the chambers required expert climbing, the slow and deliberate work of ropes and anchors on rock that crumbled at the touch. And yet someone, long ago, had made this climb routine. Someone had carried the dead up here. Inside, the team recovered 27 human remains, many of them partially mummified by the arid mountain air, their tissue drawn tight against bone across the passage of centuries. The bioarchaeologist Dr. Jacqueline Eng examined them, and what she found unsettled even seasoned researchers. Roughly 67% of the bodies bore cut marks on the bones, not the ragged tearing of scavengers or the fractures of violence, but the deliberate patterned incisions of a ritual, a practice of defleshing, performed with metal knives before the bodies were placed in the cliff. These remains belong to what scholars call the Samdzong culture, dating to somewhere between 1,250 and 1,750 years ago, ancient by any reckoning. And yet, in the strange arithmetic of Mustang, these bodies were relative newcomers to their own tomb, for the caves themselves are far older. The Mustang cave network is not a single site, but a vast, staggering system, an estimated 10,000 chambers riddling the cliffs and canyons of this high desert, an entire subterranean architecture hollowed from living rock. And some of those chambers show evidence of human occupation stretching back to the late Neolithic, to roughly 800 or 700 years before the Common Era. 3,000 years ago, human beings were already living inside these walls. The mummies the 2010 team found were laid to rest in caves that had, by then, been part of the landscape for well over a millennium, inherited, reused, repurposed. Burial chambers that became dwellings, dwellings that became, in later centuries, the quiet cells of Buddhist meditation. Layer upon layer of human intention, pressed into the same fragile stone, each generation building upon the silence of the last. Pete Athens, standing on those cliffs, understood how precarious the whole record had become. The very forces that had preserved the mummies, the wind, the cold, the relentless dryness, were also erasing the evidence. Clues to when these caves were built and by whom, he observed, are melting before our eyes. Every season of erosion carries away another fragment of the answer. The cliffs are dissolving grain by grain, and with them the fingerprints of a people who chose to live and die where almost no one else could. Consider what that image asks of us. A civilization, thriving in a high-altitude death zone, bodies defleshed with care and lifted into the sky. 10,000 chambers carved into rock that offers no mercy and no easy foothold. The mainstream reading is measured and cautious. These were funerary practices, dwellings, sacred spaces, evolving across 3,000 years of continuous human presence. That much the bones and the pottery confirm, and yet the deeper question refuses to settle. Why here? Why build up into the cliff face in the one environment on Earth most hostile to the human body? What compelled a people to invest such labour, such risk, such devotion in a place where merely breathing is a struggle? Who had the means to do this? Who had the motive? And what precisely did they know that we have forgotten? To even begin to answer those questions, we have to leave the cliffs of Mustang for a moment and confront the thing that makes them so extraordinary in the first place. Not the carving, not the mummies, the air itself. The Tibetan Plateau is the highest and largest plateau on the surface of the Earth, a raised world averaging more than 14,800 feet, 4,500 metres, above the level of the distant sea. To stand upon it is to stand higher than nearly every peak in the continental United States, and to do so not on a summit but on flat, open ground that stretches toward the horizon in every direction. It is a landscape of impossible scale, a table of stone and grass and frozen soil so vast that it shapes the weather of the entire continent, and it is, by every measure of human physiology, a place we were not built to inhabit. At these elevations, atmospheric pressure collapses. The oxygen that at sea level fills the lungs with easy abundance thins to roughly 2/3 of its familiar density. The molecules are still there, but spread thin, harder to gather, harder to pull into the blood. The body responds with a condition physiologists call hyperbaric hypoxia, a state of chronic oxygen deprivation that forces every system into adaptive overdrive. The heart labours, the breath quickens, the blood thickens as it strains to carry more oxygen with each circuit. For a visitor, the first days at altitude bring headaches, nausea, sleeplessness, the crushing fatigue of a body fighting simply to remain conscious. For the unacclimatized and the unlucky, the fluid can gather in the lungs or the brain, and altitude itself becomes lethal. Researchers at the University of Colorado's Altitude Research Center have spent decades quantifying exactly what this environment costs the human body. They describe high-altitude living not as a hardship, but as a profound biological challenge, one that, over the long span of generations, has demanded genuine genetic adaptation. Among the most remarkable of these is a variant of a gene called EPAS1, an allele that helps the body manage oxygen transport and regulate the strain on the heart. It is a molecular signature of survival, written into the very DNA of the plateau's peoples across countless generations of pressure and loss. We will return to that mutation later, for it holds one of the strangest secrets in this entire story. But for now, hold this simple fact. The human body had to be rewritten to live here. The plateau did not merely test its inhabitants, it changed them, and thin air is only the first assault. The plateau sits closer to the sun's unfiltered fury than almost anywhere humans dwell. The ultraviolet radiation here is among the highest on the planet. In the summer months, the daily erythemal dose, the measure of radiation capable of burning and damaging skin, often reaches double that of lower cities like New Delhi. The light is not gentle at this altitude. It is a weight, a pressure, a slow burning that etches itself into skin and stone alike. To work outdoors here, to quarry rock or haul timber under that relentless sky, is to labour beneath a sun that punishes every hour of exposure. Then there is the temperature, which does not so much fluctuate as lurch. On the plateau and its high rim, the difference between the sun-baked afternoon and the frozen night can swing by dozens of degrees within a single rotation of the Earth. A body can sweat at midday and shiver toward death by midnight. The growing season, that narrow window in which the frozen ground releases its grip long enough for anything to take root, lasts fewer than 90 days in many places, and in the harshest zones, barely that. Warming trends in recent centuries have stretched it slightly. But historically, the plateau offered a cruel bargain to anyone who would farm it. A handful of frantic weeks to coax barley or millet from thin, cold soil before the frost returned to claim everything. And still, people came. The archaeological record is unambiguous on this point, and it is astonishing. At a site called Nuya Devu, high on the plateau, researchers have found evidence that human beings occupied these heights as far back as 40,000 years ago. 40,000 years. And not only anatomically modern humans, the genetic trail suggests that the Denisovans, an archaic human lineage, may have walked this high, cold country long before us, and perhaps left within us the very adaptations that made survival possible. The plateau has been a stage for human endurance since before the last great ice age released its grip on the world. The anthropologist Cynthia Beale, who has spent a career studying how populations adapt to these heights, captured the fascination precisely. Adaptation to high-altitude hypoxia, she observed, is fascinating because the stress is severe, experienced equally by everyone at a given altitude and quantifiable. There is no cheating the mountain, no wealth, no cleverness, no status exempts a body from the thinness of the air. Every lungful is rationed by the same brutal physics, whether you are a king or a labourer, a monk or a mummy sealed in a cliff. The altitude is the great leveller, and it levels without mercy. Which brings us back to the central wonder, the one the sky caves force upon us before we have even begun to explain them. For the civilizations that carved cities into these peaks, survival was not the baseline from which their achievements rose. Survival was itself the first and most enduring achievement. Before a single chamber was hewn, before a single body was lifted into the cliff, these people had already accomplished something the modern world, with all its oxygen tanks and thermal gear and satellite maps, still finds difficult. They lived here. Generation after generation they were born and they grew and they buried their dead in air that kills ordinary ambition. To build anything at all in such a place required a will that seems, from the comfort of the lowlands, almost incomprehensible. So we're left standing at the foot of the cliff, looking up at those honeycomb chambers, and the question has only sharpened. It was never merely how they carved the stone. It was why anyone would want to. Why a people would pour their lives into settling the one landscape most determined to reject them. The answer, if there is one, does not lie in the stone alone. It lies in what these people believed, in how they saw this terrible, beautiful, oxygen-starved world. And to understand that, we have to peel back the layers of the plateau's history until we reach the oldest one of all. The layer beneath the temples, beneath the empire, beneath even the memory of most who live there now. Before Buddhism came to Tibet, the plateau already had a soul. Long before the 7th century of the Common Era, when Buddhist teachings began their slow conquest of the high country, the peoples of these heights followed a tradition all their own, a spiritual system indigenous to the plateau, rooted in its stone and sky and water. It is called Bon, and it is one of the great overlooked keys to everything we are trying to understand. For centuries, the story most often told was that Buddhism arrived to a wilderness, that it brought civilization, writing and order to a rough and unlettered land. But that story is a distortion, one shaped by the victors of a spiritual conquest. The truth, as the archaeological record increasingly reveals, is that the plateau was never a blank slate. When the Buddhist missionaries came, they came to a world already densely spiritualized, already organized, already mapped from horizon to horizon by a people who saw the divine in every ridge and river. That older world had a name, and a heart, and a kingdom. Its heart was a mountain. Its kingdom was Zhangjung. No single figure has done more to recover this lost world than the archaeologist John Vincent Beleza, who has spent more than 3 decades walking the remote western reaches of the Tibetan plateau, documenting the physical traces of the Bon era with a patience bordering on devotion. He has catalogued rock art weathered nearly to invisibility, ritual cairns raised on windswept passes, and, most strikingly, megalithic alignments, great standing stones set deliberately across the high ground for purposes we are only beginning to guess. And from this lifetime of fieldwork, Beleza has drawn a conclusion that reframes the entire question of the sky caves. Zhangjung, he argues, was the most altitudinous civilization ever to have existed on Earth. Not a scattering of hardy nomads clinging to survival, but a genuine civilization, organised, permanent, sophisticated, built and sustained at the very ceiling of the habitable world. The evidence is written across the landscape for those who know how to read it. Beleza has documented archaic fortresses, permanent settlements, and monumental stonework at elevations that stagger belief, some sites perched as high as 17,500 feet above the sea. Let that number settle for a moment. 17,500 feet is higher than any point in the Alps, higher than the base camps of the world's great mountaineering expeditions, an altitude where modern climbers move slowly and carefully and count their heartbeats. And there, at that elevation where the air holds barely half its sea level oxygen, ancient people did not merely pass through. They built, they stayed, they raised walls of stone and set their standing megaliths against the sky, and organised their lives around the rhythms of that impossible height. The Bon tradition, and the kingdom of Zhangjung that gave it worldly form, flourished across a span of many centuries, from roughly 500 years before the Common Era until its conquest by the rising Tibetan Empire in the early 7th century, in a year often given as 625. Its historical heart lay in the west, gathered around a mountain the world now knows as Kailash, called in the old tongue Gang Tisei, a peak so perfect in its pyramidal symmetry, so commanding in its isolation, that it has been held sacred by not one faith, but several across the whole span of Asian history. To the followers of Bon, this mountain and the country around it were not merely holy. They were the axis of the world, the point where earth and heaven touched. For at the core of Bon cosmology lies an idea so different from our own way of seeing that it takes an effort of imagination to grasp it. The Bon did not view the landscape as inert matter, as mere terrain to be endured or exploited. They saw it as a living body, the body of the divine itself spread across the plateau in flesh of stone and blood of glacial water. Every mountain was a deity or the dwelling of one. Every lake, every pass, every spring had its presence, its temperament, its claim upon the reverence of those who lived nearby. The land was not a backdrop to the sacred. The land was the sacred, alive and watchful and everywhere. At the centre of that living cosmology stood the sacred mountain Zhangjung Meri, known also by the name of the deity Walchen Gecko, the patron and protector of the entire Zhangjung kingdom. To the people of that vanished civilization, this was not a symbol or an abstraction. It was a power, a presence, a divine sovereign whose favour sustained the realm, and whose mountain form anchored the whole spiritual geography of the plateau. To dwell in Zhangjung was to dwell within the reach of that deity, to build one's life and death in the very lap of the god. And here, at last, we find the first true answer to the question the sky caves posed. Why build in the death zone? Why carry the dead 155 feet up a crumbling cliff? Why raise fortresses at 17,000 feet? Why pour the labour of generations into the least hospitable ground on earth? Because to the people who did it, the altitude was not a curse to be overcome, it was the whole point. The peaks were not obstacles between the human world and the divine. The peaks were the conduits, the thresholds, the places where the veil between worlds wore thin. To climb higher was to climb closer to the gods. The thin air that punished the body was, in the same breath, the rarefied atmosphere of the sacred. The Bon did not build here despite the height. They built here because of it. Beleza has described these ancient stone monuments, the cairns and megaliths and fortress walls scattered across the western plateau, as offering a clear window into a world that existed long before any foreign faith reordered it. A window into a pre-Buddhist economy, a pre-Buddhist religion, a pre-Buddhist way of inhabiting the roof of the world. Through that window we glimpse a civilization that had already made peace with the impossible, that had already woven its survival and its worship into a single seamless act. When the mummies of Samzong were lifted into their cliff, when their bones were marked by the ritual knife, they were being placed within a landscape their ancestors had already spent 1,000 years sanctifying. The caves were not built in a void. They were carved into a world that was already, in the deepest sense, a temple. Yet a window, however clear, still frames only what the eye can reach. and so much of Jiangzhong remains beyond the glass, dissolved into the same wind that erodes the cliffs of Mustang, buried beneath the triumph of the empire that conquered it and the faith that supplanted its own. We know the kingdom flourished, and we know it fell. We know it built at heights that defy belief, and we know its cosmology gave meaning to that defiance. But its precise workings, the full reach of its organization, the true depth of what it knew about surviving where humans should not, these remain shrouded, half erased, waiting in the melting stone. The Bon saw the land as a living body of gods. The archaeologists see a civilization improbably perched at the ceiling of the world. The mummies in the cliff see nothing at all now, their eyes long closed, their bones marked by hands whose intentions we can only guess at. And standing between all of these, between the believers and the scientists and the silent dead, we are left with the strangest recognition of all. The people who carved these heights did not think they were doing the impossible. They thought they were coming home, to a country of gods that happened to lie above the clouds. The impossibility is ours, imposed by our lowland lungs and our forgetting. To them, this was simply where the sacred lived, and where they, in life and in death, were determined to live beside it. But a kingdom this old, this high, this deliberately woven into the divine geography of the plateau, did not simply fade into the mountain air. It was remembered, and then it was made to be forgotten. The histories that came after had reasons to erase it, to write over its name, to reduce a sophisticated civilization to a footnote in someone else's rise to power. And that act of erasure, deliberate, sustained, and only now being undone by the patient work of scholars sifting the stone and the fragments, is itself one of the great mysteries of the roof of the world. Consider what it takes to erase a kingdom, not merely to defeat it in battle, not merely to seize its cities and absorb its people, but to remove it from the record so completely that centuries later even the scholars who go looking must reconstruct it from glosses, from ruins, from the negative space where its name should have been. This is what happened to Jiangzhong. For perhaps 1,000 years it held sway over the western reaches of the plateau, a civilization that took root around 5 centuries before the Common Era and endured until the 7th century of it, an Iron Age polity that controlled the highest inhabited crossroads on the surface of the earth. And then, in the span of a single ambitious reign, it was undone, not only conquered, but written out. The man who undid it was Songtsen Gampo, the Tibetan king remembered by later generations as a unifier, a founder, the ruler who would draw the scattered fiefdoms of the plateau into a single expanding empire. The conquest is dated by some sources to around 625 of the Common Era, by others to roughly 645, and the discrepancy itself is instructive, for it tells us how thin the surviving record is, how much of what we say about this moment is stitched together from fragments that do not always agree. What the sources do agree upon is the shape of it. The transition was not a single clean stroke, but a campaign. Military pressure braided with political alliance, marriage and treachery folded into the same maneuver, and at its centre, according to the traditions preserved in Bon literature, lay an assassination, the killing of the Jiangzhong king Ligmincha, engineered by the rising Tibetan power. A kingdom that had endured for a millennium was decapitated, and its lands folded into the empire that would soon adopt a foreign faith and remake the plateau in that faith's image. What follows conquest is often absorption, and absorption, over time, can look a great deal like disappearance. The victors write the annals. The victors decide which names are worth preserving and which are better left to the wind. And so Jiangzhong, which had once been the cradle of an entire religion, the master of the western trade routes, the improbable master of the ceiling of the world, was relegated to the margins, a shadow kingdom, a footnote, a place half remembered in ritual texts and half invented in legend. For much of recorded history it was, in the fullest sense of the word, lost. Not lost as a city is lost beneath jungle or sand, its stones simply overgrown. Lost as a memory is lost, deliberately, systematically, by those who found it more convenient that the memory not survive at all. But the plateau, as we have seen again and again, does not forget as easily as the men who ruled it hoped. And the first thing it refused to surrender was the capital, Kyunglung-gulkar. The name itself is a poem in a lost tongue. The silver palace of the Garuda Valley, the fortress of the mythical Kyung, the great eagle-like bird of Bon cosmology. It stood, and in ruin still stands, in the upper gorge of the Sutlej River, in the Ngari prefecture of far western Tibet, southwest of the sacred mass of Mount Kailash. And here we return to a landscape we have already learned to distrust, a landscape that appears at first to be nothing more than eroded rock. The Sutlej at this altitude has cut a deep canyon through beds of pale, calcium-rich cliff, and the ruins cling to those canyon walls like something grown rather than built. Stone towers rise from the ridgelines, weathered to the colour of the surrounding rock, so that from a distance they seem almost to be geological features, natural pinnacles rather than the work of human hands, and carved into the cliffs beneath and around them, a dense honeycomb of caves, a troglodyte city, a warren of hollowed chambers stacked into the vertical stone. Those who have stood before it have reached again and again for the same image, a swallow's nest. Thousands of dark openings pocking the pale cliff face, a fortress city that seems to have been secreted into the rock itself, invisible until you are upon it, and then overwhelming. From the outside, steep cliffs and nothing more, and this is precisely how the kingdom's own memory described it. In the old Tibetan chronicle, in words attributed to the Zhangjung princess Seyarkar, the palace speaks through her voice. My dowry place is the Kyunglung Dungul Makar. People think it is vast, but from the outside it looks like steep cliffs, and from the inside it is gold and gems. From the outside steep cliffs, from the inside gold and gems. It is difficult to imagine a more precise description of what it means to seek out this vanished civilization, a place that hides its wealth behind the appearance of barren rock, that must be entered before it will yield anything at all. That the site can be named again, that Kyunglung can be pointed to on a map and its ruins photographed and measured, is not the work of chance. It is the work of two scholars pulling from opposite ends of the same problem. On one side, the archaeologist John Vincent Belletza, whose decades of field expeditions across the Western Plateau we've already met. The man who walked the high country season after season, documenting hundreds of archaic castles, megaliths and necropolises, gathering the physical evidence that a great civilization had once thrived, where the maps showed only emptiness. On the other side, the Tibetan scholar Namkhai Norbu, whose work was not conducted with rope and trowel on a cliff face, but with manuscripts and lamplight, sifting the vast literature of the Bon tradition and the fragmentary histories of early Tibet for the traces the erasers had missed. It was textual research of this kind that helped identify Kyunglung, that matched the poetry of the old chronicles to the ruins in the Sutlej Gorge, that reconstructed a legacy from words alone. The stones and the texts, the field and the archive converging on a single ghost, and between them, slowly, dragging it back into the light of legibility. Yet even as the kingdom becomes visible again, one thing about it remains stubbornly, tantalizingly opaque. We can find the capital, we can map the fortresses, we can date the necropolises and measure the towers, but we cannot fully read the language that these people spoke, and it is here, in the half-legible tongue of Zhangjung, that the mystery deepens into something almost metaphysical. The Zhangjung language is extinct. No community speaks it now, no living voice carries it forward. What survives of it survives almost entirely as fragments embedded within the ritual literature of Bon, glosses, technical terms, sacred formulae, words preserved not because anyone sought to preserve the language, but because the words themselves were holy, and could not be discarded. The single richest source is a text known as the MD-Zod Fug, the treasury of the basic space of phenomena, a Bon scripture that pairs Zhangjung terms with their Tibetan equivalents, and in doing so hands the modern scholar a partial accidental dictionary. But the corpus that emerges from all such sources together is achingly small, roughly 200 to 300 lexical items, a few hundred words salvaged from the wreckage of an entire civilization's speech. Imagine attempting to reconstruct English from 200 surviving words, most of them liturgical, none of them arranged into complete living sentences by a native speaker, and you begin to sense the scale of the difficulty. The language is not fully deciphered. It may never be. We are reading it, when we read it at all, through the frame of another language entirely, through Tibetan, the tongue of the very empire that erased it. What can be established is where it belongs in the family of languages. The consensus places Zhangjung within the West Himalayas subgroup of the vast Tibeto-Burman family, a positioning that is itself significant, for it tells us this was no linguistic island, no isolated freak of the high country, but a member of a broader family of tongues that stretched across the Himalayan world. Beyond that consensus, however, the picture blurs into debate. The linguist Christopher Beckwith and others have reached further, exploring whether Zhangjung might connect to languages and migrations well outside the Himalayan sphere, to Burushaski, that famous linguistic isolate of the Karakoram whose own origins remain a puzzle, and even, in the most ambitious formulations, to the deep prehistoric movements of peoples across Inner Asia. These are theories, and they remain contested, argued over in journals and conferences, neither proven nor dismissed. But even as hypotheses, they perform a crucial work. They pry Zhangjung loose from the image of a provincial backwater, a mere hinterland of later Tibet, and reposition it as something else entirely. A node, a crossroads, a point where peoples and words and ideas may have flowed together in an age long before writing arrived to record them. Could it be that the tongue spoken in these silver-palaced cliffs carried within it the echo of migrations that crossed half a continent? Were the people who carved these caves the descendants of movements we can now barely perceive, their language a fossil of journeys no chronicle recorded? The questions outrun the answers, and the scholars wisely do not pretend otherwise. The Bon tradition itself makes a claim more audacious than any modern linguist would venture. It holds that Zhangjung possessed not merely a language but a full writing system, indeed a set of them, its own 40 magical letters, with scripts bearing names like Ma-Chen, the Greater Ma, and Ma-Chung, the Lesser Ma. And it holds that these scripts predated the formalization of written Tibetan, that the alphabet later credited to Songtsen Gampo's own court, developed to serve the incoming Buddhist scriptures, was in some sense a latecomer to a plateau that had already known how to set language into permanent form. Whether the historical record can fully sustain that claim is another matter, tangled in the same problem of erasure that haunts everything about this kingdom. But consider what it would mean if even the outline were true, that the roof of the world, the ground that lowlanders still imagine as the last empty frontier of human habitation, had its own letters, its own scribes, its own written memory, centuries before the empire that conquered it learned to write at all. And here the language becomes more than a linguistic puzzle. It becomes the perfect emblem of everything we're attempting to do with this vanished world. We are reading Zhangjung through gaps. We are reading it through borrowed alphabets, through the Tibetan glosses of Bon Ritual, through the negative space where its own script should have survived and did not. 200 words, a handful of scripts remembered mostly as legend, a capital identified by matching a princess's poetry to a canyon full of caves. The partial illegibility of the language is not an obstacle to understanding this civilization. It is the truest expression of its condition. Zhangjung comes to us as a palimpsest, a text scraped and written over, its original hand showing through only where the later ink ran thin. To read it at all is to read a ghost, and to accept that some of what we most want to know has been carried off permanently into the same wind that has been eroding these cliffs for millennia. What did they call the mountains they worshipped, in their own tongue, before the conquerors renamed the world? What did they whisper over their dead as the knives did their ritual work? The words existed once. They rode the thin air of the plateau, and now, for the most part, they're simply gone. But a language is a thing of breath and memory, and breath and memory are the first things to leave a dying culture. What lasts, what always lasts longest on the roof of the world, is the stone. And so we turn from the vanished words back to the enduring rock, back specifically to the cliffs of Mustang, and to a question we have so far only stood in awe before without truly asking. Not why the caves were carved, not what they meant, but simply, concretely, brutally, how? How does a people without machines, without steel scaffolding, without any of the apparatus we would consider essential, cut 10,000 chambers into a vertical cliff face at the edge of the breathable world? The answer, established through the patient archaeological work of Mark Aldendifer of the University of California, Merced, and Charles Ramble of the École Pratique des Hautes Études, is that they did it the hardest way imaginable, by hand, one chisel stroke at a time. The romantic assumption, the one a first glance might encourage, is that these caves are natural, that the soft conglomerate of the Mustang cliffs simply eroded into hollows that people later moved into. And that assumption is not entirely wrong. Some of the caves did begin as natural erosion pockets, weaknesses in the rock where wind and water had already started the work. But the great majority were not gifts of nature. They were systematically excavated, laboriously, deliberately, hand-hewn from cliffs that offered no help beyond their relative softness, and the proof is written on the walls themselves in a language far easier to read than Zhangjung. Tool marks, grooves cut into the stone 2 to 3 centimeters wide, still visible on walls and ceilings after all these centuries, the unmistakable signature of metal chisels driven again and again into the rock. Iron, most likely, perhaps copper or bronze in earlier phases. The same category of metal edge, one cannot help but notice, that left its ritual marks on the bones of the dead lifted from these very cliffs. The knife that defleshed the corpse and the chisel that carved its tomb were kin, forged of the same hard-won technology, wielded by the same determined hands. Now hold that image in mind and place it where it belongs, not on flat ground, not in a quarry a worker could walk into, but on a near vertical face of soft rock, dozens or hundreds of feet above the valley floor. The engineering problem sharpens into something almost vertiginous. To cut a chamber into such a cliff, a worker had first to reach the spot, and to reach it meant suspension, rope scaffolding lowered from above or anchored from below, a system of lines holding a human body against a crumbling wall while the hands did their patient, dangerous work. Consider the sheer arithmetic of effort. A single chamber, large enough to serve as an ossuary chapel or a granary or a meditation retreat, represents weeks of chiselling, and there are 10,000 of them, stacked into the cliff, layer upon layer, until in places the networks reach 8 or 9 stories in height. Vertical neighbourhoods, entire apartment blocks of hollowed rock, hanging in the air where nothing has any business hanging. Those who have gazed up at the densest of these networks have described the effect as a giant sandcastle, a fragile crenellated mass of holes and ridges that looks as though a strong rain might dissolve it, and yet has stood for well over 1,000 years. And all of it accomplished at an altitude where, as we have seen, the air carries only around 2/3 of the oxygen found at the sea, where every swing of the chisel drew on lungs already labouring. Where the effort we would find punishing at rest was here the baseline condition of a working day suspended over a gorge. Aldendifer, who has spent years inside these networks, is careful not to romanticize what he found, and his caution is itself revealing. He does not claim the builders possessed some lost mathematics, some secret geometry beyond our own. I don't think that they had mathematical principles, he has said, and yet in the same breath he cannot dismiss what his own eyes report. But when you look at it, it was very systematic and organised. No formal mathematics, perhaps, and yet an order, a logic, a systematic intelligence written into the arrangement of chambers and passages and stories. Not the abstract theorems of a Euclid, but the accumulated practical genius of a people who had solved, through generations of trial and stone, the problem of how to build a city into the sky. It is a reminder we will return to more than once, that the absence of what we would call formal science does not imply the absence of profound knowledge. The knowledge was in the hands, in the eyes, in the inherited discipline of the work, and like so much on this plateau, it was knowledge that did not stay put. For the caves themselves did not stay put in their purpose either. The archaeology reveals not a single moment of construction, but a long layered history of use, a rock warren repurposed again and again as the centuries turned and the needs of the living changed. In the earliest period, running from around 1,000 years before the Common Era to perhaps 600 or 700 years into it, the caves were above all places of the dead, burial chambers, the ossuary function that put the Samzong mummies into their cliff. Then, around the turn of the first millennium of the Common Era, a shift. The caves became residential, places for the living to shelter, most likely during stretches of regional instability, when a home cut into a vertical cliff, reachable only by rope or ladder that could be withdrawn, offered a security no valley-floor dwelling ever could. And later still, between roughly the 12th and 15th centuries, another transformation as the chambers took on a contemplative life. Meditation retreats and monastic spaces, their walls now painted with Buddhist murals, their recesses stocked with manuscripts. Tomb, then fortress home, then monastery. The same hand-cut hollows serving death, then survival, then the search for enlightenment, as if the cliff itself were passing through the ages of a human soul. Stand at the base of such a cliff now, as the light of a late afternoon slides across the pocked and honeycombed face, and try to hold all of this at once. The natural pockets that gave the first builders their start. The chisel marks 2 centimeters wide, still crisp in the soft rock. The ropes, long rotted, that once held living workers against the stone. The mummies who arrived first, the refugees who came 1,000 years later, the monks who painted their gods on walls that had held bones. And behind it all, the same impossible altitude, the same thin and punishing air, the same refusal of a people to accept that there was any height at which they could not make a home. It is systematic, Aldendifer tells us, and organised, and one believes him. But standing there, one senses something the word systematic cannot quite hold. A patience, a ferocity of intention, a civilization that looked at a sheer cliff at the ceiling of the world and saw, not an obstacle, but a place to live and die and pray, and then set about the centuries of labour required to make it so. The words of that civilization have mostly blown away. The kingdom that may have organised this world was written out of history by the empire that conquered it. But the stone remembers what the annals tried to forget, and the tool marks remain, and the chambers still climb the cliff in their improbable stories toward the sky. What we cannot yet read in the language of Jiangjung, we may still be able to read in the rock, if we learn how to look, and if the melting cliffs give us time enough to learn it before they surrender the last of their secrets to the wind. And yet stone is only one of the archives the plateau keeps. There is another, older and more intimate, one that does not weather in centuries but lies waiting in the dark of the sealed chambers, dry and cold and undisturbed, the archive of the body itself. For while the tool marks tell us how the caves were made, and the murals tell us what the later inhabitants believed, it is the bones that tell us who these people were, how they lived, and what the high thin air demanded of the flesh that dared to endure it. And what the bones say is not gentle. When bioarchaeologist Jacqueline Eng bent over the remains recovered from these cliffs, the 27 partially mummified individuals, and the scattered skeletal material drawn from chambers across the network, she was reading a document written in calcium and collagen, a record no scribe had edited and no conqueror had thought to burn. The remains had lain in their rock cavities for centuries upon centuries, preserved by the very conditions that made the plateau so hostile to the living. The cold that slowed decay, the dryness that starved the bacteria of decomposition, the altitude that kept the air itself sparse and sterile. What killed ordinary ambition had, in death, become a kind of embalming. And so the bones came down from the cliff not as dust but as testimony, still bearing the marks of the lives they had carried. Those marks are hard to look at in their way. The skeletons show the signature of relentless physical labour, the kind of wear that accumulates not over years, but over a lifetime of pushing the body past what it was built to bear. There are healed fractures, bones that broke and knitted again, the crooked seams of injuries survived rather than escaped. On one skull recovered from a cliffside collapse, Eng found multiple healed fractures across the cranium and the jaw, injuries grievous enough that their healing was itself a small triumph of endurance. What caused them, she cannot say with certainty. Signs of violence, she suggests, or perhaps something more prosaic and no less brutal in that vertical world. Or maybe, she offers, he was kicked by a horse. It is a strikingly human moment in the science, that shrug of honest uncertainty, and it opens rather than closes the question. Was this a society scarred by conflict, one whose people fought and fell and rose again? Or simply a world so physically punishing that a life without broken bones was the exception rather than the rule? How does one tell the wounds of war from the wounds of merely surviving, when the surviving itself was a kind of war? The stress written in these skeletons goes deeper than fractures. Across many of the remains, Eng identified periosteal lesions, inflammatory changes on the outer surface of the bone, the fingerprints of chronic infection, of a body fighting battles beneath the skin for months or years at a stretch. In a modern clinic, such lesions speak of untreated disease, of persistent low-grade illness carried like a weight through the whole of a life. And carried here, remember, at nearly 14,000 feet, where every breath already delivered only 2/3 the oxygen of the world below, where the heart laboured, where a wound healed slowly and an infection could smoulder for a lifetime without ever quite resolving. To live in these caves was to live sick and strong at once, the body enduring what it could not overcome, the labour never pausing to let the flesh recover. Who were these people that they pressed on through such attrition? What drove a community to accept this cost generation after generation, rather than descend to easier ground? And what does it mean that they chose to stay? Then there is the strangest mark of all, and the one that most complicates the picture. On certain skulls, Eng and her colleagues found evidence of deliberate cranial deformation, the shaping of the head, begun in infancy when the bones of the skull are still soft and unfused, through the careful application of bindings or boards over months and years. This is not injury. It is intention. It is a practice, now entirely extinct in the region, that reshaped the living skull into a form the culture found meaningful, a permanent, unmistakable mark carried on the body for life. Across many ancient societies scattered around the globe from the Andes to Central Asia, such deformation signified status, lineage, belonging, the body itself made into a badge that could not be removed or forged. That the people of these cliffs practiced it tells us they were not a scattering of desperate refugees clinging to rock. They were a society with hierarchy, with distinction, with a shared understanding of who mattered and how that mattering should be shown. Someone in these caves was marked from the cradle as different, as elevated, as belonging to something. But to what? What order of rank required a shaped skull at the roof of the world? What did it mean to be high-born in a place already higher than nearly anywhere humans have ever lived? And on many of the bones, layered over everything else, are the cut marks, the fine, deliberate incisions that Eng and Aldendifer have linked to defleshing, to the ritual stripping of soft tissue from the dead before their bones were placed in the cliff. We have touched already on how these marks, left by metal blades, speak to a mortuary tradition older than Buddhism in these mountains, a practice that reached back toward the earlier sky burial customs of the plateau. But set them now beside the fractures and the lesions and the shaped skulls, and a fuller portrait emerges. These were people who suffered hard in life, and were handled with ceremony in death, whose broken and infected bodies were, at the last, carefully unmade by living hands and lifted into the rock with what can only have been reverence. The same knife that defleshed the corpse served a belief. The same cliff that held the tools of survival held at the end the bones of the survivors. Cruelty of circumstance and tenderness of ritual bound together in a single archive. But the most quietly staggering thing the bones reveal is not any single mark. It is the timeline. Carbon dating places the earliest burial use of these caves at around 1,000 years before the Common Era, a full millennium before the Christian era began, and centuries before any kingdom we can name organized this ground into a state. The Zhangjung polity, powerful as it was, is an Iron Age story, its founding reckoned at around 500 years before the Common Era. But the caves were already receiving their dead 5 centuries before that, which means the human story here does not begin with any kingdom at all. It runs beneath the kingdoms, older than the annals, older than the language no scholar can fully read. 2,000 continuous years of use, across culture after culture, the burying peoples of the first millennium before the Common Era, the sheltering refugees at the turn of the age, the meditating monks of the medieval centuries, all of them adding their chapter to the same rock. The bones force the timeline open. They insist that whatever civilization we try to pin to these cliffs, it is only the visible crest of something far deeper, a human presence on the plateau that stretches back and back into a darkness we've barely begun to date. How long, truly, have people lived and died at this altitude? And how much of that story now rests unread, in bone we have not yet recovered? To sit with that question is to feel the ground of the whole inquiry shift beneath one's feet, and it invites us to move westward, out of the Kali Gandaki Gorge and its honeycombed sandcastle cliffs, up onto the vast and terrible openness of the northern plateau, the Changtang, where the land flattens into a high, cold desert, stretching toward the horizon at 4,000 and 5,000 meters above the sea. Here the ground goes on and on, treeless, windswept, so remote and so lifted into the sky that the modern imagination has always assumed it was empty, or nearly so, the wandering domain of nomads and their tents, a place too harsh to hold anything as fixed as a settlement or as permanent as a monument. And yet scattered across this emptiness, unmarked on most maps and unmentioned in most histories, stand the megaliths that almost no one talks about. They are there in their hundreds, these sites, charted patiently over decades of fieldwork by John Vincent Bellezza, the archaeologist who has spent much of his life crossing this ground on foot and by animal, cataloguing what the plateau has kept. Standing stones set upright in the earth, long rows of them marching across the land, some alignments running for hundreds of meters, circular enclosures of stone, and most curious of all, the arrangements Bellezza calls walled-in pillars, a single stone or a line of stones, ringed about by low walls, spaces that seem to have served as venues for burial rites and for commemorative observance, thresholds between the living and the dead set out under the open sky. Bellezza describes them as ghostly fields of standing stones, and the phrase is exact. To come upon such a field on the Changtang with the wind moving over the grass and the mountains blue at the edge of everything is to feel oneself in the presence of an intention that has outlived every word once spoken to explain it. Someone raised these stones, someone dragged them, set them, aligned them, and gathered here in numbers to do whatever these places were made for, and then that someone vanished, leaving the stones to keep their silence. What were they for? The mainstream reading, cautious and grounded, holds that these were primarily funerary and ritual sites, necropolises of stone, temple tombs, the enduring furniture of a cult of the dead. The dating, insofar as it can be established, spreads across the Late Bronze Age, from roughly 1500 to 750 years before the Common Era, and on into the Iron Age that followed, the very period in which the Zhangjung Kingdom rose. Indeed, these monuments are associated in their geography and their forms with that same legendary polity, the earliest architecture, perhaps, of the civilization whose language we cannot read and whose name its conqueror tried to erase. They are, as Beleza puts it, the dawn of civilization in Tibet, the first hard evidence that the high plateau was not merely traversed but inhabited, organized, built upon. For here is the fact these stones drive home, against every comfortable modern assumption. A sophisticated, sedentary society thrived at these brutal altitudes, long before Buddhism ever reached them. People built settlements in many locations across the Changtang, Beleza tells us, not tents pitched and struck with the seasons, but places meant to stay. The empty plateau was never as empty as we thought, and yet the stones will not surrender their full meaning to the funerary reading alone. For some of these alignments, these long rows running hundreds of meters across the ground, appear to be oriented, pointed with apparent deliberation toward the rising sun at the solstice, toward the turning points of the solar year. If that orientation is real and not coincidence, then these were not merely graves. They were instruments. They were a way of holding the sky still, of marking the year's extremes against the horizon, of knowing when the longest day would come and the shortest, of reading the calendar of the heavens from the highest ground that heavens have ever been read from. To raise a stone and aim it at the solstice sunrise is to declare that you have watched the sun long enough to know where it will stand on its farthest morning, that you have counted and remembered and passed the counting down. It implies a society not only settled but numerate, one that tracked number and time and space with a discipline we do not usually grant to prehistory, least of all to a prehistory unfolding above 4,000 meters in the thin cold air. Were these builders astronomers as much as mourners? Did the same stones that held the dead also hold the year? And what kind of knowledge, patiently accumulated across generations, does it take to align a monument to a point on the horizon that appears only once in the turning of the sun? The honest answer is that no one yet knows. There is no scholarly consensus on precisely who raised these stones, on the full reach of their astronomical understanding, on how the alignments were surveyed or why. The systematic study of these sites as instruments of skywatching remains, as the specialists themselves admit, in its infancy. A field barely begun on ground barely explored. And here lies the quiet scandal of it all. Consider that on the far side of the world, on the gentle plain of southern England, a ring of standing stones has drawn a century and more of intense scholarship, millions of visitors, and a place in the imagination of the entire human species. Stonehenge is a household word, and yet here on the Changtang stand alignments and enclosures of comparable scale and comparable antiquity, some of them running far longer across the ground than anything at Stonehenge, and they have received a fraction of the attention, a whisper against a roar. Why? Is it only the remoteness, the altitude, the sheer difficulty of reaching them? Or is it something in ourselves, a reluctance to grant to the roof of the world the same reverence we grant to the fields of Europe? What might we already understand about the human relationship to the sky if we had asked these Tibetan stones the questions we have asked their Western cousins? And how much are we still, even now, failing to see simply because we assumed there was nothing there to look at? The plateau, it seems, has always kept more than we credited, and nowhere is that truer than at the place we come to now, moving still westward and a little south, down into the Sutlej Valley of far western Tibet, where the land itself dissolves into something out of a fever dream, a clay forest, a labyrinth of eroded limestone pinnacles and ravines carved by wind, and vanished water into shapes that seem too strange to be natural. And rising from the heart of that eroded maze, 150 to 180 meters above the valley floor, climbs one of the most spectacular ruined cities on the face of the earth. This is Saparang, the capital of the kingdom of Guge, and it is a city that refused when its time came to die quietly. Guge endured for more than 7 centuries, from around 900 years into the Common Era until 1630, and in that span it built into a single towering clay mesa a fortress unlike anything else on the plateau. 10 stories of interconnected palaces, chapels, storerooms and tunnels, bored and stacked and wound into the soft rock until the mesa itself became architecture, until it was impossible to say where the hill ended and the city began. To approach it even now, 4 centuries into its abandonment, is to feel the breath catch. The whole eroded valley seems to lean toward it, and within, past the crumbling outer works and the collapsed galleries, the walls still hold what may be the most astonishing thing of all. Murals, vivid and intact, their pigments still glowing with the blues and golds and deep reds of a Tibetan Buddhist art at the height of its powers, painted figures gazing out from the plaster across 400 years of silence, as though the painters had only just set down their brushes. It is for this that the site has been called a cultural ark, a vessel that carried something precious across a flood of collapse and kept it safe. For Guge was, from its founding, an act of deliberate preservation, a monument built against forgetting. It was founded by Kida Nimagon, a great-grandson of Langdama, the last emperor of that Tibetan empire whose armies had, centuries before, swallowed the kingdom of Zhangzhung and erased its name. When that empire in turn collapsed into fragments and chaos, the royal line scattered, and one branch of it made its way west into these eroded valleys, and there founded a refuge, a revival state, a place where the culture of the fallen empire might survive and gather itself again. There is a bitter symmetry in it. The descendants of the dynasty that had erased one high civilization, now building their own high civilization as a shelter against their own erasure. And the thing they chose to preserve above all was the faith. Guge became the crucible of what scholars call the second diffusion of Buddhism into Tibet, the great reflowering of the religion after the dark century that followed the empire's fall. From these clay chapels, the teaching spread outward again, carried on the roads that Guge commanded, until the influence of this remote mountain kingdom reached across Central Asia. A political act of defiance and a deliberate cultural arc, both at once. A kingdom founded on the conviction that some things are worth carrying up into the mountains and defending against the erasure of time. The art historian Roberto Vitali, who has studied Guge's murals more closely than almost anyone, has traced in them a sophisticated synthesis of traditions, the artistic vocabularies of India, of Kashmir, of Tibet itself, braided together on these high walls into something new and radiant. To stand in one of these chapels now, with the thin light falling through a broken opening onto the face of a painted deity, is to understand that this was no provincial outpost mimicking distant fashions. It was a centre in its own right, a place where the great currents of Asian art and thought met and were transformed at 14,000 feet. The murals are a record of a renaissance, a document of a moment when the highest kingdom on earth reached out and touched half a continent. And then it ended, abruptly, and in a manner still not fully understood. The kingdom that had flourished for 700 years fell in the space of what local memory insists was almost no time at all. Legends say the Guge kingdom disappeared in just one day, one official has observed, but the story is still unclear. The bare facts we can assemble speak of internal religious strife, of a king who reached for foreign allies against the powerful monastic establishment within his own realm, of a siege laid by the neighbouring legacies in 1630, and of an annexation that swallowed the state. Some accounts tell of a royal family decapitated after they surrendered themselves to spare their people from massacre, a final, terrible bargain struck at the gates of the clay fortress. And behind the human drama, modern researchers detect a colder force at work. The Little Ice Age, a drop of 2 to 4 degrees in the region's temperature, enough to fail the fragile high-altitude harvest that had always fed the kingdom, enough to hollow it out from within until a single siege could bring it down. Politics, faith, foreign steel, and a cooling sky, each may have played its part, and no single one of them fully explains the suddenness of the end. So the murals still glow in the empty chapels, and the tunnels still wind through the clay mesa, and the 10 stories still climb toward the sky, and the question hangs in the thin air of the Sutlej Valley as it hangs over every ruin on this plateau. How does a civilization that flourished for 700 years, that painted these walls, that carried a religion across a continent simply stop? What passed through the tunnels of Tsaparang in that final day, the legends can no longer describe, and what still waits, unlit and unexplored, in the deeper passages bored down into the heart of the mesa, the hollows beneath the palace that no mural illuminates and that no history has yet fully mapped. To answer that last question, you must go down. Not around the mesa, not across it, but into it, down into the darkness that the builders of Guge carved beneath their own feet, into the passages that thread the clay body of Tsaparang like veins through living tissue. For the great secret of this fortress is not what rises 300 meters above the Xiangquan River, gleaming and vertical against the desert light. The great secret is that the mountain is hollow, and that the people who made it their capital thought of the stone beneath them not as a foundation, but as a room, and of the room beneath that as another, and of the whole 300-meter pyramid of earth as a single, unified, breathing structure, a thing to be inhabited from crown to root. Descend, then, into the first of the tunnels, and the temperature drops with each step. The light behind you contracts to a coin, and then to a slit, and then to nothing, and the walls close in until, in places, the passage narrows to the width of a single body turned sideways. Here the builders did not carve a corridor so much as a wound, a thin seam bored through the packed sediment of the mesa, its ceiling low enough to force a bowed head, its floor worn smooth by feet that stopped walking here 4 centuries ago. The air is cool and mineral and utterly still. Where a shaft of daylight finds its way down through some fracture far above, it lands on a wall black with soot, the accumulated residue of countless butter lamps and cooking fires, the carbon breath of a vanished population fixed forever into the clay. To press a palm against that darkened surface is to touch the exhalation of a civilization. The tunnels of Tsaparang were not decorative, and they were not an afterthought. They were the circulatory system of the entire city. Consider the vertical hierarchy the site imposes, the royal palaces perched at the summit, remote and defensible, the temples and their glowing chapels in the middle band, and the residential dwellings, the ordinary human warren of Guge, clustered at the base near the river. In an ordinary town these would be separate zones, connected by open streets and exposed paths. But Tsaparang was no ordinary town, and its people could not afford to move through the open. So they connected the levels from within, boring passages that allowed a body to travel from the base of the cliff to the royal quarters at the top without once stepping into daylight. A twisting stone staircase hidden inside a tunnel climbs through the heart of the mesa toward the palace, a spiral of steps cut into the mountain itself, ascending in darkness toward the seat of the king. To have climbed it in the 17th century, lamp in hand, was to move through the interior of the state as a thought moves through a mind. How extensive was this network? The honest answer is that no one yet knows its full extent because much of it has never been opened. Recent photogrammetric surveys conducted by the Chinese Academy of Cultural Heritage have begun to map the interior of the mesa with a precision no earlier expedition could achieve, digitally reconstructing the honeycombed volume of the site room by room. What they have recorded is staggering. Something on the order of 445 rooms, close to 900 caves, and dozens of Buddhist pagodas are packed into this single, pyramidal formation of clay and stone. 445 rooms, an entire city folded into a single mountain, and many of those chambers still sealed, still dark, still waiting behind collapsed passages and drifted sediment. Some sources speak of 4 primary secret tunnels threading the mesa, but the sheer density of the recorded chambers argues for something far more elaborate than 4 corridors, a system so intricate that the distinction between building and cave, between room and tunnel, begins to dissolve entirely. Where does the architecture end and the mountain begin? At Saparang, the question has no clean answer because the builders refuse to draw the line. This is the deepest lesson of the place, and it is worth pausing on. The people of Guge thought in 3 dimensions. They did not lay a city upon the land, they inhabited a volume of the earth. Their engineers looked at a mesa rising sheer above a desert river, and saw not an obstacle to be built around, but a mass to be occupied, hollowed, terraced, tunnelled and crowned, until the natural formation and the human settlement became a single indivisible thing. Compare it to the great vertical settlements the world remembers by name, the cliff dwellings of the American Southwest, the rock-hewn churches of Ethiopia, the cave monasteries scattered across the wider Himalaya, and Saparang holds its own among them, and in the sheer integration of its vertical logic perhaps surpasses them. Yet it is known to almost no one. It sits at the edge of the modern imagination as it once sat at the edge of the medieval maps, a masterwork of 3-dimensional urban planning that the wider world has scarcely troubled to look at. Why should a city this ingenious remain so nearly invisible? What does it say about the erasure of this plateau that its most sophisticated fortress is a footnote? And yet the tunnels were never only about movement, or storage, or the elegant marriage of settlement and stone. They were, at their heart, about survival, about the day the enemy would come. For every passage that let a monk carry lamp oil up to the temples in peace could, in war, let a defender move unseen between the levels, appearing where he was not expected, vanishing before he could be struck, holding a mountain against an army with a fraction of the numbers such a defence should require. The mountain itself was transformed into a weapon. To attack Saparang was to attack a labyrinth that could bleed you from the inside while never showing you its face. The tunnels are a defensive strategy written into geology, a bet placed centuries in advance that the people of Guge would one day need to disappear into their own mountain and fight from within its walls. It is a chilling thing to walk those passages now and understand that they were built in anticipation of a siege. The architecture is a prophecy, and the prophecy came true. But before the siege, before the massacre, before the sudden silence, there is one more thing the tunnels must hold, a witness. For in the very generation before Guge fell, the kingdom that the medieval maps of Europe had left as an empty void was seen, briefly and vividly, by an outsider's eyes. And the record he left is the only eyewitness account of Guge at its height that survives anywhere on earth. His name was Antonio de Andrade, a Portuguese Jesuit born in 1580, a man of the missionary age when the Society of Jesus was pushing the frontiers of the known world in every direction at once. He had heard rumours, from Mughal India where he was stationed, of a Christian community hidden somewhere in the mountains to the north, a garbled tale, most likely a distortion of the Buddhist monasticism that no European had yet seen. Whatever the truth of the rumour, it drew him upward, into terrain that no one from his world had ever crossed. In the year 1624, he became the first known European to enter Tibet, crossing the Mayana Pass into the high desert of the Ngari Plateau, and descending at last into the valley of Guge and the shadow of Saparang. The following year, in 1625, he returned with 4 companions to establish a formal mission, the first Christian mission on the roof of the world. The journey nearly killed him, and his own words carry the terror of it better than any summary could. "We began to climb these lofty mountains," he wrote, "which have not their like perhaps on the surface of the globe." He described passages so narrow between the peaks that we could only just put one foot before the other, a man edging sideways along the flank of the highest mountains on earth, roped against a fall into gorges that had no bottom he could see. Snow blindness, altitude sickness, the murderous cold of the passes, Andrade endured them all, driven by a faith as vertical as the terrain he was crossing. And when at last he came down out of the killing heights into the valley of the Sutlej, what he found astonished him. He did not find an empty void. He found a functioning kingdom, a capital rising in stories against the desert sky, its palaces at the summit and its temples in the middle band, and its houses clustered at the river, the very three-dimensional city whose tunnels still wind, dark and sooted beneath the ruins today. He found a population he could count in the thousands, tens of thousands by his broader reckoning, living and trading and worshipping in a place his own civilization had believed uninhabitable. He found monumental architecture, a sophisticated theology, a religious establishment of learned and powerful men. He found, in short, a civilization, complex, self-assured, and utterly unknown to the world he had come from. His letters, dispatched back to his Jesuit superior in Goa and eventually reaching Europe, where they were translated into several languages and read with astonishment, made Guge visible in Western consciousness for the first, and, as it would turn out, very nearly the only time. Preserved now in the Vatican archives, those letters are the single surviving eyewitness record of the Guge kingdom as a living thing, the only window through which the outside world ever looked upon this civilization while it still breathed. And here the story turns and darkens, for the very openness that let Andrade in would help bring the kingdom down. The king of Guge, it seems, received the Jesuits not merely with tolerance but with genuine warmth. He was, by the account preserved in those letters, eager for contact with the outside world, curious about the strange faith these foreigners carried, and, crucially, locked in a long, quiet struggle against the power of his own Buddhist clergy. The monastic establishment of Guge was vast and influential. The king's own brother stood among its highest lamas. To a ruler seeking to curb the reach of that establishment, the arrival of a rival faith, backed by the prestige of distant and powerful patrons, must have seemed a gift. He granted the Jesuits leave to build a church. He allowed them to preach. A small Christian community began to grow in the shadow of the temples, reaching in time something like 400 souls, 400 converts in a kingdom of thousands. It sounds like a trifle. It was in fact a catastrophe in waiting. For to the lamas of Guge, the king's patronage of these foreigners was not a matter of a few hundred believers. It was an assault upon the entire order of their world, upon their authority, their revenues, their monopoly on the sacred, and upon the delicate balance of power between throne and monastery that had held the kingdom together for 7 centuries. The king had reached past his own priesthood for a foreign ally, and the priesthood understood correctly that its position was under threat. What began as theological unease curdled into an anti-Buddhist movement in the king's own policy, and then into open political strife, and then into something for which there could be no peaceful resolution. The search for the lost kingdom had become, in the bitter phrase of one modern observer, the very reason for its destruction. Andrade's mission, an act of faith, of courage, of extraordinary human endurance across the deadliest mountains on earth, had lit a fuse in the heart of Guge that could not now be pulled. The king's brother, the High Lama, moved against the throne, and to break a king who held the most defensible fortress on the plateau, a fortress hollowed into a mountain and threaded with tunnels built precisely to withstand a siege, the rebellious monks reached beyond the borders of Guge entirely. They invited in the army of the neighbouring kingdom of Ladakh. Around the year 1630, Ladakhi forces crossed into the valley of the Sutlej and laid siege to Tsaparang. The siege of a mountain is a slow and terrible arithmetic. The defenders held the heights, The tunnels let them move unseen. The sheer clay cliffs rose 300 meters above the river, and the palace at the summit was, by any conventional measure, unassailable. The Ladakhi commanders confronted a problem that the geometry of the place made almost insoluble: how to reach the top of a mountain whose only interior passages were held by an enemy who could appear and vanish at will. And so they attempted something desperate and strange, a solution that still scars the site today. They began to build. Against the flank of the mesa, they raised a great stone structure, a wall, a ramp, a stairway of masonry meant to climb the outside of the mountain and carry their soldiers up to the level of the palace where the tunnels could not stop them. It was to be a stair to the roof of a kingdom. They never finished it. The unfinished stone stair still clings to the side of Tsaparang, a monument to a siege, a physical measure, laid in rock, of exactly how hard this civilization was to kill. But it was not killed from the outside in the end. It was killed from within. The precise sequence is preserved partly in the royal chronicles of Ladakh and partly in the local traditions that have clung to these ruins ever since, and the two do not always agree in their particulars. Accounts differ, as they always do at the edge of catastrophe. What they hold in common is a shape, and the shape is unbearable. The king, watching his people suffer, chose at last to end it. He surrendered. He gave himself and his royal house into the hands of the besiegers and the rebellious monks in exchange, so the accounts insist, for the lives of his subjects. A final bargain struck at the gates of the clay fortress, a king trading his own body for his people's breath. It should have been the end of the killing. It was not. The traditions tell that the surrender was honoured with a massacre, that the royal family was slaughtered despite the king's submission, that the population which the king had died to spare was cut down anyway. A civilization that had stood for 700 years, that had painted the glowing chapels, that had carried the second diffusion of Buddhism across a continent, was extinguished in the space that legend compresses into a single day. What physical evidence remains of that final horror is a matter that demands care, for here the record grows uncertain, and the honest witness must say so plainly. Travel accounts and local lore have long spoken of a mass grave at the base of the Tsaparang cliffs, of a pit of skulls numbering in the hundreds, the remains, the stories say, of those thrown or driven from the walls when the killing came. It is a detail that haunts every account of Guge's fall, and it fits, terribly, with the shape of the tradition. Yet it must be set down carefully. Reports of that ossuary belong more to legend and to the accounts of travellers than to any confirmed peer-reviewed archaeology, and the exact toll of the massacre is genuinely debated among those who study the site. What the excavations have confirmed beyond doubt is the enormity of the ruin itself, the extensive remains, the defensive works, the tunnels bored through the mesa, the abandoned chambers, the whole vast three-dimensional city fallen silent all at once. Whether or not the pit of skulls awaits confirmation, the silence is real, and it is total. A place that had held tens of thousands of lives, that had been continuously occupied for 7 centuries, simply stopped. Stand at the base of those cliffs now, where the unfinished Ladakhi stair climbs toward nothing, and the scale of the stillness is almost physical. Above you the 10 stories rise, hollow and windowed and empty. Somewhere within the mesa the tunnels wind through their darkness, the soot of the last fires still black on their walls, the twisting stone staircase still spiralling up toward a palace with no king. 445 rooms and no voices, 900 caves and no breath. The desert wind moves through the broken openings and finds nothing to disturb but dust, and the faint cold light falling across the painted faces of gods who outlived everyone who worshipped them. This is the documentary's first full stop, not a mystery of who built a thing or how, but a mystery of ending, a civilizational death rendered specific and brutal and precisely dated, a kingdom that we can watch, through Andrade's astonished eyes, in the very act of living and then lose entirely within a handful of years. And that is what makes Guge different from the sky caves and the megaliths and the erased kingdom of Jiangjung that lie scattered across the rest of this plateau. Those vanished into the deep silence of a time before records, their endings smoothed away by the millennia until only the stone remains to speak. Guge vanished in the full light of history, seen and named and counted by an outsider's pen, its fall recorded in the chronicles of the kingdom that destroyed it. We know more or less what happened. We know the year. We know the cause, the tangled cause at least of faith and jealousy and foreign steel in a cooling sky, and still the suddenness of it defies comprehension. Still the question hangs in the thin air of the Sutlej Valley. How does a thing so intricate, so hard-won, so ingeniously wedded to the mountain that held it, come apart so completely and so fast? How does 700 years of accumulated life, the murals, the tunnels, the theology, the vertical genius of a people who inhabited a mountain as though it were a body, how does all of it collapse into an ossuary and a silence and an unfinished stare? Perhaps the deeper unease is this. Guge was not the fragile thing. Guge had survived the very things that break kingdoms: the altitude, the cold, the isolation, the long dark century after the Empire's fall. It had turned a mesa into a fortress precisely so that it could not be taken. And it was taken anyway, not by the mountains and not by the winter, but by something it carried inside itself, a quarrel over which god to kneel before, and a king who reached for a foreign friend against his own priests. The fortress held. The faith did not. And so the tunnels that were built to let a civilization vanish into its own mountain and survive became, in the end, the passages through which its killers moved. The prophecy fulfilled, the weapon turned. What, then, are we to make of the pattern that keeps repeating across this roof of the world, of high kingdoms that mastered the impossible sky and could not master themselves? And what other silences, less documented than Guge's, but no less complete, still wait in the folds of this plateau to be read? There is a particular kind of silence that does not belong to Tibet at all, but to the West's idea of it, a silence manufactured far from any mountain, in the imagination of a man who never stood on the plateau, never gasped at 14,000 feet, never watched the light break over Kailash, and yet this manufactured silence has shaped how the entire modern world reads these ruins, these bones, these erased kingdoms more powerfully than any excavation report ever could. To understand why the true history of the roof of the world has been so slow to surface, so easily overwritten, so persistently misread, one must turn away from the stones for a moment and look instead at a novel. In 1933, an English writer named James Hilton published a book called Lost Horizon. In its pages, a small aircraft, fleeing unrest, crashes somewhere in the unmapped Himalayan vastness, and its survivors are led to a hidden lamasery, cradled in a valley sealed from the world by walls of ice and rock. There, among wise lamas and unhurried scholars, time itself seems to slow. The inhabitants age with impossible gentleness. Violence, hunger, ambition, the whole clamouring machinery of the modern age falls away. Hilton gave this place a name that would outlive his book, outlive his century, and lodge itself in the vocabulary of nearly every language on Earth. He called it Shangri-La. Hilton had never seen Tibet. He built his utopia from fragments, from travellers' accounts, from missionary letters, from the scattered and half-digested reports of a sacred geography he did not fully understand. And he built it for a specific audience at a specific moment. A Western readership scarred by the trenches of one world war and sinking into the despair of the Great Depression, hungry for a place where the wounds of modernity had never reached. Shangri-La was never meant to be a description. It was meant to be an escape. It offered a fantasy of longevity, of peace, of wisdom preserved intact behind a wall of mountains. A place, the story implied, where humanity had gotten it right and had then quietly hidden that rightness away from the rest of us. The book was a phenomenon. Within 4 years, it was a Hollywood film. Within a generation, the word had become a synonym for paradise itself, applied to hotels and resorts and mountain lodges the world over, its origins in a Himalayan fever dream half forgotten. But where did Hilton's dream come from? Not from nothing. Beneath the fiction lies a real thread, drawn loosely and imperfectly from the Tibetan Buddhist tradition, the concept of Shambhala, a sacred kingdom named in the Kalachakra Tantra, one of the most complex and layered teachings in all of Tibetan Buddhism. Some traditions do speak of Shambhala as a physical hidden realm, ringed by mountains, ruled by a lineage of enlightened kings. And it was this fragment, this rumour of a concealed and perfect land somewhere beyond the passes, that filtered westward through the accounts of explorers and Orientalists until it reached a novelist's desk in England and was remade into something Tibetan Buddhism had never intended. Here is the crucial thing, and it is worth stating plainly, because the whole tragedy of the West's relationship with this plateau turns upon it. The Shangri-La myth is not a discovery story. It is a concealment story. It does not reveal Tibet. It hides Tibet, hides the theocratic complexity, the harsh and often brutal feudal conditions, the trade wars and dynastic assassinations, the massacres like the one at Guge, the 2,000-year continuity of labour and suffering written into the bones in the Mustang cliffs. All of that specificity, all of that real and difficult history was replaced by a soothing blank. A place where nothing happens except the accumulation of wisdom. A place with no politics, no violence, no economy, no death that isn't beautiful. And a blank, once installed in the imagination, is remarkably hard to fill back in with fact. The consequences of this were not merely literary. They reached in time into the machinery of global politics. Consider what happened in the decades after Hilton's novel. Through the 1950s and 1960s, as the Cold War hardened and Tibet's status became a matter of urgent geopolitical concern, the image of a peaceful, spiritual, otherworldly Tibet, the Shangri-La image, proved extraordinarily useful. The Central Intelligence Agency, in its covert efforts to support anti-communist resistance on the plateau through programs remembered under names like St. Circus, drew upon precisely this romanticized picture to win Western sympathy and funding. A nation of gentle monks and mountain sages made a far more compelling cause than the messy, particular, politically complicated reality of an actual society with all its factions and its flaws. The myth had become an instrument. The blank had become a weapon. Scholars who have spent their lives trying to see Tibet clearly have watched this process with something close to despair. The historian and writer Orville Schell captured the distortion with a phrase that cuts to the bone. Tibet in the Western imagination had become a place, he observed, where people don't make Buicks, they make good karma. A spiritual supermarket for outsiders to shop in, a screen onto which the anxious modern West could project everything it feared it had lost. And the cost of that projection was borne by the Tibetans themselves, whose actual civilization, sophisticated, struggling, altitudinous, real, was flattened into a fantasy that served everyone's needs but their own. How does one study a place honestly when the whole world has already decided what it wishes to find there? How does genuine scholarship compete with a dream that gives people exactly what they crave? And what does it mean that the most famous lost city of the Himalaya is one that was never real, invented by a man who never came, while the genuinely lost kingdoms, Zhangzhung, Guge, the Samzong culture in their cliffs, remain half forgotten in the very shadow of that fiction? Yet to leave the matter there, to treat Shambhala as merely the raw material a novelist strip-mined for a bestseller, would be to commit the very error we are trying to name. For Shambhala within the Tibetan tradition is not a diminished or embarrassing version of Hilton's fantasy. It is something far stranger, far more sophisticated, and, read correctly, far more revealing about the plateau itself than any hidden valley could ever be. Because in the Tibetan Buddhist understanding, Shambhala was never a place to be found on a map. It is a pure land, a sacred realm navigable not by yak caravan or mountain pass, but through meditative practice and internal transformation. The Kalachakra Tantra, which rose to prominence in Tibet from the 11th century onward and was elaborated across generations of scholarship, frames Shambhala as a geography of the mind as much as of the earth. The Western explorer trudging through the snows in search of a walled valley of immortals was, in a sense, making a category error so profound that no amount of searching could ever correct it. He was looking for a physical location in a tradition that had built its most precious kingdom out of consciousness itself. The 14th Dalai Lama has said it about as directly as it can be said. It is not a physical place, he explained, that we can actually find. And when one grasps that, the entire quest reorganizes itself. The teaching is deliberately multi-layered, and Tibetan scholars have long read it on several registers at once. There is an outer meaning, in which Shambhala maps onto the cosmos and the great physical cycles of time, the wheeling of the heavens, the turning of the ages. There is an inner meaning, in which the same geography corresponds to the human body itself, to the subtle channels and energies that the practitioner learns to know from within. And there is an alternative, or secret meaning, in which Shambhala is the meditative path to enlightenment, the very route by which an ordinary mind becomes an awakened one. The kingdom, on this reading, is not somewhere you travel to, it is something you become. And yet, and here the mystery folds back on itself in the most tantalizing way, the tradition is not indifferent to landscape. It describes Shambhala as a kingdom ringed all about by ice mountains, a fastness encircled by peaks of snow. Read as pure allegory, this is the fortress of the awakened mind, walled against distraction. But read literally, as some scholars have not been able to resist doing, that description matches nothing so well as the Tibetan plateau itself. The great high tableland ringed by the Himalaya to the south, the Kunlun to the north, the Karakoram to the west, a vast elevated world enclosed on every side by walls of ice. The very land these vanished civilizations chose to inhabit answers, feature for feature, to the description of the sacred kingdom. Was the map internal or external, or, most unsettling of all, both at once, the outer geography and the inner one deliberately mirrored, so that to live upon the plateau was already to dwell within a living diagram of the path? This reframes the whole hidden city narrative in a way that ought to give us pause. We have spent centuries imagining that Tibet's great secret was a place concealed from us, waiting behind the ranges to be found. But what if nothing was ever hidden at all? What if the civilization was never concealed from itself, only from outsiders who arrived without the interpretive framework to see what was in front of them? Shambhala is described too by another name entirely, the source of happiness, Budbyung in Tibetan, an awakened society understood to be ever present, accessible not to those who search hardest, but to those with the pure heart to perceive it. The prophecy speaks of a future in which the 25th king, Rudra Chakrin, will emerge to scatter the forces of darkness and restore harmony to the world, a narrative whose roots run deeper still, back to earlier Hindu texts, such as the Vishnu Purana of the 4th century, which foretold Shambhala as the birthplace of a coming king. Tibetan Buddhism took that ancient thread and rewove it into the vast machinery of the Kalachakra cycle. The kingdom was never lost. The kingdom was always a map, and the West, arriving with a compass, could not read it. So the great irony sharpens. The plateau is covered with things that genuinely were hidden. Funerary chambers cut 150 feet up a cliff, tunnels honeycombing a mesa, standing stones aligned to a solstice on the empty grasslands of the Changtang. These are the real concealments, the true vanished works. And yet the world went searching for a valley that existed only in a novel, guided by a fragment of a teaching whose whole point was that the destination was never external. The genuine mystery of Tibet was not that anything was hidden, it was that so much was in plain sight, carved openly into the world's highest peaks, and no one who came looking had the eyes to read it. What, then, were the outsiders really seeking when they went looking for Shangri-La? And would they have known Zhangjung if they had stumbled into its ruins, or Guge and its living glory, having come in search of a dream? But a civilization does not survive on scripture and sacred geography alone, however luminous. Behind the theology, beneath the myth, there had to be something brutally practical, a way of eating, of trading, of moving goods and grain and salt across a landscape where the air itself withholds a third of the oxygen a body expects. And it is here, in the unglamorous logistics of survival at altitude, that the deepest and most durable refutation of the Shangri-La fantasy is found. For these plateau civilizations were not isolated enclaves of contemplation, sealed away from the world's commerce. They were nodes in a functioning, far-reaching economic network, and the altitude that we imagine as their prison was in fact their corridor. Begin with the crop that made everything else possible. High-altitude agriculture is a razor's edge proposition. Most of humanity's staple grains simply will not ripen in the cold, thin air of 14,000 feet. But barley will. Archaeobotanical evidence, the patient science of recovering ancient seeds and grains from the deposits of old settlements, has established that domesticated barley was being cultivated in western Tibet by roughly 3,500 years before the present. This was the foundation stone. Barley, hardy and quick and forgiving of the cold, was the crop that turned the plateau from a place humans could cross into a place humans could stay. Ground into sampa, the roasted barley flour that remains a staple to this day, it became the portable, imperishable fuel of an entire way of life. Food that a traveller could carry in a leather sack across a week of frozen passes and eat without fire. The work of archaeobotanists such as Dorian Fuller has done more than simply date the arrival of the grain. It has reframed what that arrival meant. The spread of agriculture across the plateau, Fuller's research emphasises, was not merely a biological event, not simply a plant migrating along the lines of soil and climate that suited it. It was a social event, driven by human interaction, by the movement of people and knowledge and seed along established lines of contact. Barley did not walk to western Tibet on its own. It was carried there, deliberately, by human beings already moving through a connected world. The grain is evidence not of isolation but of exchange, and where barley provided the calories, the yak provided very nearly everything else. Zooarchaeology, the study of animal remains from ancient sites, confirms the deep antiquity of yak pastoralism on the plateau, a partnership between humans and a beast almost supernaturally suited to the heights. The yak carried loads across terrain no cart could cross. It gave milk and meat and wool and dung for fuel where no wood grew. It was the engine of the caravan, the living machinery that made distance survivable. Together the barley in the field and the yak on the trail form the twin pillars of an altitude economy, and upon those pillars the great polities of the plateau built their reach. Zhangjung, that powerful kingdom centered in the west, and the Guge that rose in its old heartland centuries later, did not endure by hiding. They endured by trading, for the plateau was threaded with what one might call mobility highways, ancient trade routes, some of them followed continuously for well over 2,000 years, along which flowed the goods that made high-altitude life not merely possible but prosperous. Salt from the plateau's mineral lakes, wool from the vast herds, musk, precious and portable, worth its weight many times over in the markets of the lowlands. And, in time, tea, that most Tibetan of imports, hauled up from the warm valleys to the south and east. The greatest of these arteries acquired a name that endures in memory: the Tea Horse Road, the Gyalam, a sprawling network of caravan paths that bound the Tibetan heartland to Yunnan and Sichuan, and reached outward as well toward Nepal and India, carrying tea in one direction, and horses, wool, and the wealth of the highlands in the other. The traders who walked these roads were not mystics drifting through a Shangri-La of eternal peace. They were labourers of the most demanding kind, navigating treacherous passes where the air punished every step, carrying their tsampa in leather sacks against the certainty of days without fire or shelter, driving their yaks through cold that could kill an unprepared man in a single night. And this labour is not merely inferred, it is recorded. The Tibetan Lorugyus, the historical accounts and travelogues in which the tradition kept its own memory, speak of these routes again and again as lifelines, the veins through which the plateau's life was carried. And the archaeology confirms the texts. Sites such as Banga and Gepa Serul demonstrate that permanent settlements and complex trade networks existed on the plateau not for centuries but for millennia, layer upon layer of a connected world. There remains scholarly debate, as there always must be, over the precise timing of the plateau's earliest agricultural transitions, over exactly when the balance tipped from foraging and pastoral mobility towards settled cultivation, and how quickly. The picture is not everywhere resolved, and honest researchers say so, but the broad truth stands unshaken beneath the arguments over dates. These were not enclaves, these were nodes. The high kingdoms of Tibet were bound into a web of exchange that ran from the salt flats of the interior to the tea gardens of the far southeast, from the wool of the Changtang to the markets of the Gangetic Plain. And once one sees this, the whole meaning of the altitude inverts. We've been taught to read these heights as a wall, an obstacle, a barrier, a fortress of isolation behind which a hidden civilization waited to be found. But to the people who actually lived here, the altitude was the road. The high passes were not the edges of their world, they were the through lines of it. The thin air that we imagine as a prison was the very medium of their commerce, their contact, their reach. Stand for a moment on one of those old trade tracks, in the failing light of a plateau afternoon, and try to feel it as they felt it. Not the wall we see, but the corridor they walked, the line of yaks moving patiently along a path worn by 2,000 years of feet, the leather sacks of barley flour, the bundles of wool and salt and pressed tea, the breath fogging in the freezing air. Somewhere ahead, beyond the next pass, a settlement, a caravanserai, a monastery, a fortress town clinging to its cliff, and beyond that, another and another, all the way down to the warm lands and all the way back up to Kailash. The plateau was not a void. It was a fabric, woven of roots and grain and animals and the endless labour of human beings who had learned to live where the body was never meant to thrive. And this, finally, is what the Shangri-La fantasy could never accommodate. A dream of effortless paradise has no room for the yak driver's frost-bitten hands, the trader's sack of tsampa, the 2,000-year continuity of a working economy carved into the highest peaks on earth. The truth was never a place of ease hidden behind the mountains. The truth was a triumph of ingenuity conducted in the open, upon the mountains, along the roads that ran between them, and yet even the roads keep secrets. For if these routes carried grain and salt and tea across the millennia, they carried other things too. Images, symbols, marks left deliberately upon the living rock at the passes and the sacred waypoints, a language older than the caravans that walked beneath it. Along these same corridors on boulders and cliff faces worn smooth by wind and time, the plateau's peoples left another kind of record entirely, one that owes nothing to the barley or the yak or the trade in wool, and everything to the human need to say, upon the stone itself we were here, and this is what we saw. What, then, was carved into the rock along the roads of the roof of the world? And what might it still be trying to tell us, if only we could learn, at last, to read it? Consider what it means to write without paper. On the Tibetan plateau, where trees are scarce and papyrus unknown, where the frost splits wood and the wind scours everything soft to nothing, the most durable surface available to a human hand was the stone itself. And the plateau's peoples used it. Across the whole vast arc of the Trans-Himalaya, from the cold desert valleys of Ladakh in the far west to the grasslands of Amdo in the northeast, they left tens of thousands of images pecked and incised into the living rock, an archive of astonishing scale, spanning from the Neolithic through the Bronze and Iron Ages and into the early historic period. though the greatest concentration belongs to those long millennia before writing as we know it ever reached the roof of the world. They worked patiently, with a hammerstone and a harder point, tapping and tapping until the dark, weathered skin of a boulder gave way to the lighter stone beneath, so that the image seemed to glow against the darkened rock around it. This is the technique the specialists call pecking, and beside it the finer method of incising, scratching the line directly into the surface. Neither was quick. Each figure represents hours of concentrated labour by someone who had decided, at a particular boulder in a particular place, that this image needed to exist here and nowhere else. And when one begins to catalogue what they chose to render, a world assembles itself out of the stone. Ibex above all, the wild goat of the high crags, with its great back-swept horns, appearing again and again across thousands of miles. Argali, the giant mountain sheep. Yak, the animal upon which the entire high economy turned. And among the beasts the human figures, hunters with drawn bows, riders, dancers, and most hauntingly of all, human forms frozen in what can only be called ritual postures, arms raised, bodies arranged in attitudes that seem to reach towards something beyond the frame of the rock. What are we looking at when we stand before such a boulder? At first glance it appears to be simple hunting art, a record of the chase, a tally of the kill, the universal human impulse to depict the animals upon which survival depended. And that reading is not wrong. It is in fact the sober and conventional interpretation, and it accounts for a great deal of what covers these stones. Yet the specialists who have given their lives to this material have begun to suspect that something more systematic is at work. Scholars, including Quentin Devers, working along the headwaters of the Indus, have argued that certain sequences of petroglyphs are not scattered art at all, but a deliberate grammar written across the landscape. Territorial markers, route signs, a way of encoding into the rock itself the message this ground is claimed. This crossing is watched. This is the way through. The placement is the argument. These carvings cluster at strategic river crossings, at the narrow points where a valley funnels all traffic into a single track, at the high vantage points from which a whole approach can be surveyed. They sit exactly where a traveller, arriving cold and uncertain at a fork in the road, would most need to be told which way to go and whose land he was entering. Consider what that implies. If Devers and those who think as he does are correct, then the plateau itself becomes a text, not a scattering of decoration, but a readable surface, a document written in stone across hundreds of miles of the same trade corridors that carried the salt and the wool and the pressed tea. To the traveller trained in its conventions, the rock spoke. It gave directions. It asserted ownership. It marked the sacred waypoint and the dangerous crossing alike. And yet here the mainstream reading and the deeper mystery begin to pull against each other, because to call these images a system of signs is to raise a question that no survey has fully answered. If this was writing, who was meant to read it? The obvious answer is the obvious one. Other humans, the traders and pilgrims and herders moving along the roads, receiving from the rock the information they needed to pass safely through a contested and bewildering landscape. But the obvious answer does not quite exhaust what is carved here. For alongside the ibex and the argali and the route marks, the plateau's peoples pecked into the stone the great symbols of their cosmos. There is the Garuda, the vast celestial bird that sits at the very centre of Bon and later Buddhist cosmology. The same winged being whose name was borrowed by the Silver Palace of Garuda Valley in the Jiangzhou heartland. And there is Mount Meru itself, the cosmic mountain, the axis of the world, rendered in stone at 14 and 15 and 16,000 feet by people who lived within sight of the actual peaks that inspired the idea. These are not route signs. A traveller does not need to be told at a river crossing the shape of the universe. These are statements addressed to something larger than the next caravan, and so the question deepens rather than resolves. Were these images meant for human eyes at all? Or were some of them addressed upon the rock to the mountains themselves, to the deity peaks like Jangjung Mary, to the spirits believed to inhabit the high places, to whatever presence the ritual figures with their upraised arms were straining to reach? The researcher Tashil Dawa, reflecting on this vast and only partly decipherable record, offered a thought that lingers precisely because it refuses to solve the puzzle. Even when the specific meaning has slipped beyond recovery, he observed, even when we cannot say what any single figure was intended to mean, the carving still performs its most primal function. It still says, "I was here." That is the irreducible message beneath all the others, the human insistence, hammered into stone against the erasing wind, that a person once stood at this exact place and looked out at this exact world and needed it to be known. But known to whom and for how long? A route sign implies a reader who will pass this way tomorrow. A cosmic mountain pecked into a cliff implies a reader who does not move at all. A reader as fixed and eternal as the peak it depicts. Perhaps the plateau's petroglyphs are all of these things at once, layered as densely as the occupation strata of the caves, practical signs for the living traveller, boundary claims for the rival clan, and prayers addressed to the silent gods of the summits, all cut into the same weathered surfaces by the same patient hands. What did the carver believe he was doing when he raised his hammerstone at the pass? Was he speaking to the next man down the road, or to the mountain that would still be standing when every man on the road was dust? And if the intended audience was never entirely human, if some part of this longest-running record on the plateau was always meant for the spirits of the peaks, then what does it mean that we, latecomers with cameras and survey grids, are the ones who have finally arrived to read it? The rock keeps its counsel, and the same landscape that was written upon the outside was also all this time being lived within. Beneath the surface of the plateau runs another world entirely, a subterranean Tibet of tunnels and grottos and breathing hollows in the rock, occupied so long and so continuously that the deepest layers reach back beyond every empire the histories remember. Begin at the most famous structure in all of Tibet, the great white and crimson mass of the Potala Palace rising above Lhasa, traditionally founded by Songtsen Gampo, the same unifying king who absorbed Jangjung around the year 637 and vastly expanded a full millennium later by the 5th Dalai Lama in the 17th century. To the eye, it is a mountain of masonry, a fortress monastery seeming to grow directly out of the ridge it crowns. But the palace hides something beneath its foundations that only recent documentation has brought fully to light. The Potala does not merely sit upon the rock, it sits upon a network of 23 ancient tunnels, subterranean passages woven into the base of the structure, and according to the site's former management director Shampa Kelsang, these tunnels are not decorative and not incidental, they are load-bearing. They form a structural network that distributes the enormous weight of the palace above, an engineering solution buried out of sight and out of legend. Inside these passages, the surveyors found something that stops the breath a little. The original wooden beams still stand, centuries old, and they have not rotted, and the insects have not touched them, because the builders treated the timber with the traditional smoking technique that renders it insect-resistant, preserving the wood in the dry, cold air across the long generations. Local folklore, as folklore always will, tells a richer story, that these are secret escape routes for a fleeing sovereign, or vaults where unimaginable treasure lies hidden in the dark beneath the throne, and the architectural surveys, patient and unromantic, answer that the truth is stranger for being so practical. These are not treasure vaults. They are the reason the building stands at all. Shampa Kelsang put it with a bluntness that carries its own kind of awe. Without them, he said, there would be no Potala Palace. The most sacred edifice on the plateau rests, quite literally, upon a hidden foundation of tunnels, and the hands that dug them understood something about weight and rock, and the distribution of an impossible load that most of those who have gazed up at the palace for 400 years never suspected. Yet the Potala's tunnels, for all their engineering, are the work of the historical period, of kings and Dalai Lamas whose names are recorded. To find the truly deep occupation, one must travel a little way from Lhasa, up into the hills, to a place where the cliffs are pocked with dark openings and the wind carries the smell of juniper smoke. This is Drak Yerpa, a cave complex set high on the mountainside, at elevations ranging from roughly 4,400 to nearly 4,900 meters, among the most exalted, continuously inhabited hollows in the world. And Drak Yerpa is not a Buddhist invention. Long before the Buddha's teaching reached this ridge, the caves were used by practitioners of Bon, the plateau's oldest faith, whose lineage we have already followed back into the Jangjung Dark. The Buddhists inherited a place already holy. When they came to a threshold that had been crossed by ritual for who knows how many generations before them, and what practitioners they were. The masters who withdrew into these caves to meditate are among the most luminous names in the whole Tibetan tradition. Padmasambhava himself, Guru Rinpoche, the tantric adept credited with taming the plateau's demons and planting Buddhism in its soil, is said to have meditated here in a grotto called the Dawa Puk, the moon cave, for 7 years. 7 years in a hollow of freezing rock, at nearly the altitude where jetliners cruise. Atisha, the great Indian teacher whose arrival helped kindle the second diffusion of the faith we trace through the ruins of Guge, retreated here as well. The caves of Drak Yerpa are, in the memory of the tradition, a place where the extraordinary went to become more extraordinary still, where the human mind was pushed to its limits, in a setting where the human body already stood at the very edge of what it could endure. Here, though, the conventional story of ascetic heroism collides with the discovery from an entirely different discipline, and the collision is illuminating. For when the geologists surveyed these cave systems, they found that many of them sit near geothermal zones, that the plateau, restless beneath its frozen surface, vents its inner heat through certain fissures and hollows in the rock. And where those vents rise, the caves do something that no ordinary high-altitude cavity should be able to do. They stay warm. They maintain, year-round, temperatures above freezing, in an environment where the open air would kill an unprotected body in a single night. Here is a non-mystical explanation, offered soberly by the surveys, for one of the enduring puzzles of subterranean Tibet, why specific caves, and not others, were returned to across the millennia, occupied and reoccupied, sanctified layer upon layer until the strata of habitation reach back well before Buddhism's 7th century arrival. The saint did not choose the moon cave only because a vision led him there. He chose it perhaps because it was survivable, because the mountain, in that one hollow, breathed warmth into the killing cold. And this is the quiet revelation buried in the geology. We have thought of these peaks as sacred, and they were. We have thought of them as brutally hostile, and they were that too. But we have overlooked a third truth that sits between the other two. In certain hidden places the mountains were hospitable, not spiritually but thermally, physically, in a way entirely invisible to anyone standing on the frozen slope outside. The heat rose from below, unseen, and made a room in the rock where a human being could live. Was the sanctity of these caves, then, a memory of their warmth, the accumulated reverence of countless generations who had found, in a specific dark hollow at 4,500 meters, a place where the plateau permitted them to survive the night? And how many of the plateau's holiest sites, one begins to wonder, are holy precisely because they were, first of all, warm? The mountain, it seems, does not only speak from its carved surfaces, it also exhales. And yet neither the carved rock nor the breathing cave can account for the deepest mystery of all, which is not written on the plateau, nor buried beneath it, but carried in the very blood of the people who accomplished all of this. For the question that has shadowed this entire journey, the question we have circled since the first sky cave came into view, is finally a biological one. How? How did human beings not merely endure but flourish here? Build kingdoms, cut 10,000 chambers into cliffs, meditate for 7 years in freezing grottos, drive caravans across passes at 17,000 feet, in an atmosphere holding roughly 2/3 of the oxygen the body evolved to expect. For most human beings, high altitude is a slow assault. The body panics, senses the thinness of the air, and floods itself with hemoglobin, thickening the blood in a desperate attempt to carry more oxygen. A response that brings its own dangers: sludged circulation, cardiovascular strain, the chronic mountain sickness that can kill. The lowlander who lingers too high pays a price written in the arteries, but the Tibetans do not pay it. In 2010, a team led by the geneticist Rasmus Nielsen at the University of California, Berkeley, identified in Tibetan populations a distinctive variant of a gene called EPAS1, a variant that has, in the years since, been nicknamed the super athlete gene. Those who carry it do not overproduce hemoglobin at altitude. Their blood does not thicken. Instead, they process the scarce oxygen with an efficiency that spares them the whole cascade of high-altitude damage, living and working and bearing children at elevations that would slowly break an ordinary human body. Here, at last, was a hard biological answer to the question the whole plateau had been asking. The people who built the sky caves were not simply tougher. They were, at the level of the gene, differently built. And then, in 2014, further research revealed where this variant had come from, and the answer was one of the most extraordinary findings in the history of human genetics. The Tibetan EPAS1 haplotype was not a mutation that arose within the modern human line. It was inherited through interbreeding from the Denisovans, an extinct species of hominin known almost entirely from a handful of fossil fragments recovered in Siberia's Denisova cave, a scattering of bone and tooth from a human relative that vanished from the Earth some 50,000 years ago. The Tibetan version of the gene is nearly identical to the Denisovan sequence, and distinct from that of every other modern human population, including populations that carry more Denisovan ancestry overall, yet do not carry this particular gift. Somewhere on the edge of the plateau, in the deep prehistoric dark, ancestral modern humans encountered this other kind of human, and mingled with them, and inherited from that encounter a fragment of code that would one day make the High Kingdoms possible. Nielsen stated the implication with the plain force of a man who understood what he was looking at. This shows very clearly and directly, he said, that humans evolved and adapted to new environments by getting their genes from another species. Sit with the enormity of that. The capacity to build civilization on the roof of the world, to cut the funerary chambers of Samzong into the cliff, to raise the silver palace of Garuda Valley, to honeycomb the mesa of Saparang with 400 rooms, to meditate 7 years in the moon cave, may rest, in a specific and documented biological sense, upon material acquired from a species that no longer exists. The introgression, as the geneticists call it, likely occurred as ancestral humans moved through Eurasia. The beneficial variant later swept through the Tibetan population as they settled the plateau for good, favoured so strongly by the killing air that it represents one of the clearest cases of natural selection ever documented in our species. The builders of the sky caves, then, were not ordinary people straining against extraordinary conditions. They carried within them the inheritance of the vanished, a gift from a ghost lineage absorbed into the human bloodstream on the margins of this very land, surfacing tens of thousands of years later in the lungs and blood and beating hearts of the people who alone could thrive where the body was never meant to survive. And so a strange symmetry closes over the whole plateau. We have followed a civilization that the histories tried to erase, a language nearly extinct, a kingdom extinguished by siege, a myth invented to hide the truth. Everywhere the theme has been vanishing, of peoples, of tongues, of knowledge lost to time. But here, in the double helix itself, the vanishing runs deeper than any conquest or collapse. For the very thing that made these heights habitable was itself a legacy of the disappeared, a fragment of a lost humanity carried forward in the bodies of the living, invisible, unspoken, and until this century entirely unknown even to those who bore it. The Denisovans left no palace and no petroglyph. They left something more intimate. They left the ability to breathe. What then does it mean to be a builder on the roof of the world, to be in a precise and measurable way a different kind of human, shaped by an encounter no memory records and no chronicle preserves? The stone remembers in its carved ibex and its cosmic mountains. The caves remember in their layered floors and their smoke-cured beams. And the blood remembers too, most faithfully of all, in a single ancient variant threading down through 50,000 years of the dark. The people of the plateau were not visitors to an impossible place. They were, body and bone and gene, made for it, and made by a hand that reached out of a vanished world to touch them. What else, one begins to wonder, has been passed down along that unbroken line, waiting still beneath the surface of the ordinary, in the people and the stones and the breathing hollows of the highest land on earth? And yet, for all that the blood remembers, the body's gift meant nothing without the land's permission. A mutation that let the lungs draw more from the thin air could keep a herder alive on the pass. It could not by itself ripen barley at 14,000 feet, or fill the meltwater channels that fed the terraced fields below Saparang, or grant a kingdom the surplus that lets it raise temples and armies and princes. For that, something else was required, something the genes could not supply and the chronicles never thought to record. The plateau needed the sky itself to soften, however briefly, over the centuries when its greatest cities rose, and it did. The evidence lies frozen, layer upon layer, in the ice that caps the highest ridges, a record more patient and more exact than any human hand ever kept. Deep in the western reaches of the plateau, on the Gulia ice cap and far to the northeast on the Dund, glaciologist Lonnie Thompson and his team from Ohio State University drove hollow drills down through the compacted centuries, extracting cores of ancient ice. Long translucent cylinders in which every winter's snowfall and every summer's dust had been sealed like pages in a book that had never been opened. Thompson has spent a lifetime pulling these archives from the world's high places, and he has a phrase for what they are. The glaciers, he says, are early warning systems for the shifting climate of the whole planet. But on the roof of the world they are something more literal still. They are the bank accounts of water upon which entire civilizations depended, the frozen reservoirs from which meltwater ran down in the warm months to feed the fields and the herds and the walled towns clinging to the river gorges. And when one reads the ice, a story emerges that no bond text and no royal chronicle preserves, the story of when the account was full and when it went bankrupt. The cores tell of a warming. Between roughly 800 and 1200 of the Common Era, the Tibetan Plateau passed through a climatic optimum, a window in which temperatures stood warmer than in the centuries before, by some readings 1 to 2 degrees above the present. It sounds a trivial figure. It was not. At extreme altitude, where a single frost can end a growing season, and the margin between harvest and starvation is measured in a handful of frost-free days, 1 or 2 degrees is the difference between a village that endures and a valley that empties. In that window the glaciers gave more freely. Meltwater ran fuller through the summer channels. The killing frosts loosened their grip a little at the edges of the fields, and the narrow band of altitude at which barley could be coaxed to ripen crept, for a few generations, a little higher up the slopes. The sky relented, and the plateau for a time breathed. Now lay this frozen calendar beside the human one, and the alignment is almost uncanny. The medieval warm period on the plateau, 800 to 1200, corresponds precisely to the florescence of the Guge kingdom, founded around 900 by the great-grandson of Langdama, rising through its centuries of murals and monasteries and its second diffusion of the Dharma. It corresponds to the peak occupation of Mustang's cliffside chambers, the era when the honeycombed cliffs held their fullest life. It corresponds to the expansion of the cultures that inherited the ground where Zhangzhung had ruled. The warmth and the wealth arrived together. The temples went up while the ice was giving its water freely, while the fields ran a little higher and a little fuller than they ever had before or would again. Was it coincidence that the roof of the world's most ambitious kingdoms flowered in the very window when its climate briefly forgave them? Or were the murals of Tsaparang and the mandalas of Lo Monthang, in a sense no monk would have recognized, paintings made possible by a thaw? For the thaw did not last. After roughly 1300 the ice begins to tell a different tale, a cooling and with it a drying, the onset of the long chill that historians in Europe would come to call the Little Ice Age. The figures in the record grow harsh. Some studies of the plateau suggest that temperatures fell as much as 4 degrees between the 14th century and the 17th, the reverse of the medieval gift and far larger. The frost-free days contracted. The higher fields, so recently within reach, slipped back beyond it. The meltwater that had run full now ran thin, or came at the wrong time, or failed. The bank account that had been overflowing began, decade by decade, to empty. And a high kingdom is a fragile thing, balanced always on the narrowest of surpluses. Take away even a little of the margin, and the whole structure begins to sway. Consider then the fate of Guge in this cold new light. We have already followed its final agony, the religious strife, the king who welcomed the Jesuits to check his brother's clergy, the clergy who in turn summoned the Ladakhi army, the siege upon the mesa, the unfinished stone stair, the surrender and the massacre that snuffed out 700 years in a season. It has always been told as a story of faith and treachery, of men and their quarrels. But increasingly researchers read beneath the human drama to the deeper pressure driving it. A kingdom whose harvests were failing, whose herds were thinning, whose people were hungry and whose granaries were emptying under the lengthening cold. Such a kingdom is a kingdom primed to fracture, its factions sharpened by scarcity, its defences hollowed from within. The collapse of Guge in the 1630s is coming to be seen not merely as the outcome of a single dynastic crisis, but as the endpoint of a slow environmental strangulation, the moment when a state already weakened by a century of cooling proved unable to withstand the shove of invasion. The Ladakhi army did not create the vulnerability, the climate did. The soldiers merely arrived to find the door already ajar. Here, perhaps, is the plainest and least mystical truth in all of this high country. We have spent so long among vanished languages and erased kingdoms, among sky burials and hidden paradises and the ghost lineage in the blood, that it is tempting to reach always for the strange, to imagine that the coming and going of these civilizations obeyed some hidden law beyond ordinary understanding. Yet the ice cores offer a clock, and it is a mundane one. Warmth built these kingdoms, cold broke them. The fluorescence and the failure, the murals and the massacre, follow the temperature line drawn in the frozen record with a fidelity that no legend can match. Climate, not mysticism, set the tempo of the roof of the world. The mountains did not choose their favourites. The sky simply grew kind, and then grew cruel, and the works of men rose and fell in its shadow like breath fogging and clearing on cold glass. And still one cannot help but wonder how many of the plateau's mysteries, the sudden collapses and the unexplained abandonments, are simply the shape of a changing sky, written in stone by people who never knew what was moving above them. Some scholars, it is true, caution against drawing the lines too neatly. Whether these climate epochs were truly global, perfectly synchronized across hemispheres, remains a matter of genuine debate. But over the plateau itself, in the specific readings pulled from Guge and Dunde, the profound local impact of the warming and the cooling is hard to dispute. The bank account rose, the bank account fell, and the civilizations rose and fell with it. Yet if the cold emptied the fields and toppled the kingdoms, it did not end the living tradition of this land, not entirely, and not everywhere. For the border that runs through these mountains, the line between what is now Nepal and what is now the Tibet Autonomous Region, has proven to be one of the most consequential accidents in the whole history of Tibetan culture. On one side of it, in the 20th century, the monasteries of the plateau faced the storm of the Cultural Revolution, when temples were gutted and images smashed, and centuries of accumulated devotion reduced to rubble across the high country that had once been Jangjung and Guge. On the other side, in a walled town at some 3,800 metres in Upper Mustang, a small enclave of that same culture survived almost untouched, protected not by any special holiness, but by the simple fact of which nation's flag flew above it. That town is Lo-Monthang, the walled capital of the former kingdom of Lo, founded in 1380 by a ruler named Aim Pal, raised, that is, at the very hinge of history, in the generation when the warm centuries were ending and the long cold was setting in. Mustang was absorbed into Nepal in the 18th century, yet it kept its own king, its own monarchy behind its mud brick walls, until as recently as 2008, when the Nepalese government abolished the royal title. Until 1992, the region was a restricted, demilitarized zone, sealed off from the outside world. Even now it opens only slowly, and only to a few. And it is precisely this remoteness, this long enclosure, that made Lo-Monthang what it is so often called, one of the last pure enclaves of traditional Tibetan Buddhist culture anywhere on earth. What the plateau lost, Mustang kept. The living tradition that flowered under the medieval warmth and was so grievously wounded across the border found in this one walled town a place to go on breathing. At the heart of Lo-Monthang stand two temples raised in the 15th century, in the decades after Aim Pal's kingdom took shape, the Thubchen and the Jampa, whose interiors hold some of the finest surviving examples of classical Tibetan Buddhist art in existence. The Jampa Lakhang is noted for a treasure found in few places anywhere, a collection of some 1,500 mandalas painted on its walls, geometric maps of the cosmos rendered in mineral pigment, each a diagram of a universe. For centuries the butter lamps burned before these images, and their smoke rose and settled, and the frescoes darkened beneath a slow accumulating veil of soot, and the mud brick walls behind them cracked and shifted in the freeze and thaw of the high seasons. By the turn of the 21st century, the finest paintings of this last enclave were in danger of being lost not to any army, but to time itself, to the patient erosion that takes even what conquest spares. And so, between 2008 and 2012, a conservation effort came to Lo-Monthang, led by the American Himalayan Foundation, to save the Thubchen and the Jampa before their treasures faded past recovery. What is striking about that work is not only its technical care but its texture, the way it wove the living community into the rescue of its own inheritance. More than 100 local Loba people were trained in the arts of conservation, turned from farmers into skilled artisans, taught to stabilize the ancient structures, and to lift the centuries of soot from the murals using traditional materials, clay and straw and mineral pigments, the same substances from which the temples had first been raised. The past was mended, that is, with the hands and the materials of the place itself, so that the healing was of a piece with the making. But before any hand was laid to the walls, another kind of care was taken, a care that speaks to how these people understand the very images they were about to touch. An abbot performed the Aga ceremony, a ritual in which the spirits of the divinities dwelling in the murals were gathered up and drawn out from the painted walls into a ritual mirror, so that the deities might be kept safe elsewhere while the work went on, and returned to their places when it was done. To the conservator's eye, these were frescoes, surfaces of pigment and plaster to be cleaned and consolidated. To the monastic community, they were living presences, and to touch them without first inviting their occupants to withdraw would have been a violation. Consider what that reveals. Here, in this walled town, the images are not artifacts, they are inhabited. And the whole point of the restoration was never merely to preserve the paint. The lead conservator, Luigi Fieni, put it as plainly as it can be put. The gompas, he said, the monasteries, are only fully revived when they are filled with living practitioners. A temple restored and emptied is a museum. A temple restored and prayed in is alive. This, then, is the difference the border has drawn. Stand within the Jampa Lakang at Lo Monthang, beneath its 1,500 mandalas, in the flicker of the butter lamps and the low murmur of the monks who tend it still, and you are standing not in a preserved ruin but in a continuity, a thread of practice unbroken from the days when Aim Pal walled his little kingdom against the coming cold. The monks who maintain these temples are custodians of more than their own devotion. They are, whether they name it so or not, keepers of a wider civilizational memory, a memory that reaches across the mountains to the emptied monasteries of Guge and the megalith country of old Jiangzhung, where their counterparts, if any remain, live under fundamentally different constraints. What does it mean to be the last of something and to know it? To light the lamps each morning in the one place the storm passed over, aware that on the far side of a mountain range the same lamps were extinguished within living memory? The monks of Lo Monthang do not speak of themselves this way, but the weight of it is there, in the walls they clean, and the mirror the abbot filled and emptied, in the simple fact of a candle still burning where so many others went dark. For the darkness on the other side of that border was not only the darkness of the Cultural Revolution, receding now into history. It is a living condition, expressed today in something as bloodless and bureaucratic as an excavation permit. Archaeology on the Tibetan plateau is not, and has never been, a neutral science. It is a high-stakes political contest over who gets to speak for the dead, and the state that controls the ground controls the story that ground is allowed to tell. For Beijing asserts a sovereign authority not only over the territory of Tibet, but over its historical narrative, and the tool of that assertion is a national heritage framework that recasts the plateau's ancient kingdoms as Chinese patrimony. The Guge kingdom of the 9th to 17th centuries, the Zhangzhung civilization that ran from around 500 before the Common Era to the 7th century of it, the whole Bon Era substratum beneath them, all are folded in this official telling into a story in which Tibet has been an integral part of China since antiquity. Research is guided by national 5-year plans, and the research that is favoured is the research that reinforces the narrative. History becomes an instrument. The murals of Tsaparang, the standing stones of the Changtang, the funerary chambers of the sky caves, every one of them is made to answer a question it was never carved to answer, the question of belonging, of whose past this is, and access is the sharpest instrument of all. The Tibet Autonomous Region remains the only territory in all of China where foreign researchers, journalists and diplomats face extraordinary restrictions, requiring special permits that are rarely granted for the most sensitive archaeological sites. Excavations are strictly state-controlled. The independent scholar, the outside perspective, the inconvenient interpretation, all are in effect silenced not by argument, but by the simple withholding of permission to enter. The ground itself is fenced, and only the sanctioned may dig, and only the sanctioned reading is allowed to emerge from the soil. One thinks of Belessa's decades of survey work, of Aldendorfer's teams in Mustang, labour made possible in Nepal that grows ever harder across the line, where the past is a state secret guarded as jealously as any border. Against this stands a very different kind of archive, not of stone but of paper and voice, and not on the plateau at all but far to the south, in the Indian hill town of Dharamsala. There, in 1970, the 14th Dalai Lama founded the Library of Tibetan Works and Archives, and there the exile community has gathered the manuscripts and the oral histories and the accumulated memory of a civilization in flight, a repository built precisely to preserve what the official narrative would rather forget. The histories kept in Dharamsala challenge Beijing's account at its root and offer a counter-record against the day when the record can be freely read. Between the sealed excavation on the plateau and the open archive in exile, the whole contest is laid bare. Two libraries of the same past on opposite sides of a mountain wall, telling irreconcilable stories about who the builders of the sky caves were and to whom their bones and their stones belong. Into this contest in 2001 came an unexpected pressure. When the ruins of Guge appeared on UNESCO's tentative list, the roster of sites proposed for eventual World Heritage recognition. The listing did something the ruins alone could not. It internationalized the conversation, drew a global eye to the honeycombed mesa of Tsaparang and the emptied kingdom around it, and in doing so turned the crumbling clay towers into active terrain in a living argument over identity. A ruin on a tentative list is no longer merely local. It has become a matter the wider world may notice and pronounce upon, and in some small measure hold to account. There is a phrase worth carrying away from all of this, that in seeking to manufacture national belonging through coercion, a state reveals a fundamental insecurity. It can suppress Tibetan expression, one observer has noted, but it cannot transform Tibetan identity. And in that gap lies the whole meaning of these stones. For the ruins are not inert, they are not spent things, safely locked in the past waiting passively for scholars to measure them. They are active ground in a contest still being fought, a living political struggle over who gets to define the soul of the roof of the world. Every permit granted or withheld, every site relabelled, every mural restored across the border in Lomonthang while its twins across the range stand under lock. Each is a move in a game whose stakes are nothing less than the ownership of memory itself. Stand then for a moment on either side of that invisible line. To the south, a walled town where an abbot draws the gods from the walls into a mirror, and 100 farmers learn to heal the frescoes of their ancestors, and the lamps burn on unbroken. To the north, an emptied kingdom whose ground is fenced and whose story is written for it by a distant capital, its ruins recast as another nation's inheritance. The mountains between are the same mountains. The blood in the people is the same blood, bearing the same ancient variant threaded down from the vanished lineage. The ice above them holds the same frozen calendar of warmth and cold that raised and ruined the kingdoms alike, and yet the past on one side lives, and on the other it is contested, curated, controlled. Who, in the end, owns a ruin? Who owns a language, a bloodline, a burned temple, a chamber cut 150 feet up a cliff by hands that have been dust for 1,000 years? The stone cannot answer. The bones cannot answer. And so the answer, for now, belongs to whoever holds the ground, and to whoever, across a border or in exile or bent over a mirror full of gathered gods, refuses to let the memory go dark. And yet, for all the borders that now divide the plateau, there is a way of seeing that dissolves them entirely. Lift the eye above the fences and the permits, above the sealed excavations and the open archives, and look down upon the whole of it at once. The entire arc of the roof of the world, from the sky caves of Mustang in the far southwest to the megaliths scattered across the northern Changtang, from the honeycombed mesa of Saparang to the emptied silver palace of Kyunglung, from the geothermal caves of Drakyerpa to the petroglyph fields cut into the varnished rock along the old caravan tracks. Look down upon them all, not one at a time as the archaeologists must, working a single site through a single season, but together as a single field of light. And when you do, something extraordinary happens. The scattered points begin to speak to one another. The isolated marvels resolve into a pattern. What we've been calling separate mysteries, this kingdom, that culture, these caves, those stones, reveal themselves as facets of one thing, a thing so large and so long-lived that no single excavation could ever have contained it. What was it, then, that we were looking at all along? Consider what the map shows when the sites are laid upon it together. 2,000 kilometres of the highest inhabited terrain on Earth, running west to east across the crown of Asia, and threaded along its whole length a chain of human work spanning 3,000 years, from the burial chambers of Mustang, whose oldest use reaches back toward 1,000 years before the Common Era, to the clay towers of Guge, which stood until the 17th century of it. 3 millennia of continuous occupation at altitudes where 2 out of every 3 breaths of oxygen has been stolen from the air. And across that vast distance and that vast span of time, the same signatures recur. The same architectural logic appears again and again. The cliff face read as a place to be excavated rather than merely dwelt beneath. The honeycombing of living rock into stacked chambers, the marriage of cut cave and rammed and layered earth. The same trade goods surface at site after site, silk carried up from the lowlands, salt scraped from the northern lakes, wool and musk and tea moving along the caravan roads, and with them the small portable freight of religious iconography, the images that travelled as readily as the merchandise. The same sacred figures are pecked into the rock from Ladakh in the west to Amdo in the northeast, the ibex, the argali, the Garuda spreading its wings, the world mountain rising in stepped tiers. And in the very blood of the people who did all this, the same inheritance runs, the high-altitude variant threaded down from a vanished lineage older than any kingdom, binding the builders together at the level of the cell. When all of it is set side by side, could it be that the plateau was never a series of isolated experiments in survival at all? For that is the temptation, and it is a natural one, to see each of these places as a lonely triumph, a doomed and separate flowering of ambition in a place that should have refused human life outright. It is how the sights first come to us, one at a time, each with its own name and its own dating problem and its own unanswerable questions. The sky caves feel like their own private riddle, a thing complete unto itself. Zhangjung feels like a ghost that haunts only its own erased ground. Guge seems a self-contained tragedy, a kingdom that rose and fell within the walls of a single mesa. But this is an artifact of how we have looked, not of what is there. We have been examining a single vast tapestry through a series of small windows and mistaking each glimpsed patch of thread for the whole design. Pull back far enough, and the threads run continuous across all the windows at once. Zhangjung was the cradle of the Bon religion, and Bon is the cultural current that flows through nearly every one of these sites. The megaliths of the Changtang carry its marks, the caves of Mustang hold its burial logic, the geothermal retreats were sacred to it before ever a Buddhist meditated within them. The trade routes that fed Guge with silk and salt were the same arteries that had carried goods and gods across the plateau for 2,000 years before Guge was founded. The chambers cut into the Mustang cliffs, and the chambers honeycombed through the Tsaparang Mesa answer to the same instinct, refined across a millennium. Were these truly strangers to one another, or were they a single long conversation, carried on between communities who understood each other across enormous distances and enormous stretches of time? These scholars who have spent their lives on this ground have felt the shape of it, even when the political boundaries of the ancient states remain in dispute. There is honest debate still over how centralized the Zhangjung kingdom truly was, whether it commanded a unified state in the way we imagine states, or something looser and more federated, a web of allied communities bound by shared belief and shared exchange rather than by a single throne. But the debate over its politics does not dissolve the coherence of its culture. The architectural logic is remarkably uniform across the whole field. The same reliance on rammed earth, the same excavation of the cliff, the same reading of vertical stone as habitable space. And the man who has surveyed more of these high monuments than perhaps any other living scholar, who walked the ground for 3 decades and more, has put the matter in words that reframe the entire question. The monuments of Upper Tibet, he has said, are not merely ruins. They are the enduring signatures of a sophisticated society that mastered the world's most challenging environment. Signatures. The word repays attention. A ruin is a broken thing, a subtraction, what is left when something has been taken away. But a signature is an assertion, a mark deliberately made, a name written by a hand that wanted to be known. What then, if we've been reading these places wrong from the beginning, grieving them as losses when we ought to have been reading them as declarations? For the deepest error, perhaps, has been the assumption of vanishing. The whole grammar of how these civilizations reach us is a grammar of disappearance. Zhangjung, the kingdom that was erased, Guge, the city extinguished in a single bloody season, the language no one can fully read, the culture lost to time, the knowledge that appeared and worked and then was gone. And there is truth in each of those individual accounts. Kingdoms did fall, a language did go silent, a massacre did empty a mesa. But to take those separate endings and conclude that the civilization itself vanished is to make the same mistake as the traveller who watches one strand of a braided river run dry against a gravel bar and declares the river dead, never turning his head to see the dozen other channels still running full a stone's throw away, carrying the same water toward the same sea. The plateau's ancient culture was exactly such a braided river. Trade, ritual, and the exchange of blood itself wove its many channels into one coherent, enduring stream, and that stream flowed for 3,000 years before the consolidation of the Tibetan Empire gathered it into a single course. When one channel failed, when Zhangjung fell to Songtsen Gampo, when Guge fell to the Ladakhi siege, the water did not vanish. It moved. It found the other channels. It kept running. Have we all this time been mourning a death that was only ever a change of course? Stand for a moment at any single point along that river and feel how the currents converge upon it. Stand in a burial chamber of Upper Mustang, 150 feet up a cliff face, in the dry dark where the dead were laid in fetal curl with the goods that would follow them. The iron-chiselled walls around you were cut by hands that shared a blood with the hands that raised the standing stones 500 kilometres to the north, and with the hands that pecked the ibex into the rock along the caravan road, and with the hands that would, 1,000 years later, mix the pigments for the murals of Tsaparang. The salt in the offerings, the silk in the wrappings, the very iconography of the goods came to this cliff along roads that bound it to every other site on the plateau. You're not standing in an isolated marvel. You are standing at a single knot in an immense and living net, and every thread that runs out from beneath your feet runs, if you follow it far enough, to every other place we have walked through. The sky caves, the megaliths, the ruined kingdoms, the ghost of Zhangjung, the breathing caves, the rock cut with names, one map, one conversation, one river. And we came to it strand by strand, and called each strand a mystery, because we could not, from within a single channel, see the whole braided water at once. What would the ancients have made of our confusion, we who could not see, for looking too closely, the very network they lived within as easily as breath? and there is a final grace in how that network reaches us at all. A grace built into the very cruelty of the place. For the plateau is a paradox held in a single fist. The cold and the thin dry air that punished every living thing that ever tried to make a home here, that shortened the growing season to a knife's edge, that cracked the walls of the fortresses and mummified the food in the storerooms, and killed ordinary ambition where it stood. That same cold and that same aridity became, for everything that did not survive, the most faithful keeper the human record has ever known. The environment is so harsh, the mountaineer who worked those cliffs observed, that it actually preserves things that would have disappeared in a more temperate climate. What kills the living, in other words, embalms the dead. The plateau is a natural desiccation chamber, a machine for arresting decay, and it has been running without interruption for 3,000 years. Is it not a strange mercy that the place least willing to sustain life should prove the place most willing to remember it? Consider what that mercy has held for us. In the sky caves of Mustang, in Choza, and the honeycombed cliffs around it, human remains have lain since long before the Common Era, some dating from 2 centuries before it, some from 1,000 years after, and they lie there still, curled in the fetal attitude of burial, their grave goods beside them, the flesh drawn down and darkened upon the bone but not gone, not rotted into the anonymous mineral of ordinary graves because the dry high air simply would not permit it. The moisture that drives decay everywhere else on earth was never present to do its work, and so the dead of the plateau are not skeletons only. They are people, held in a stillness so complete that the marks of a mortuary knife remain legible on their bones after 15 centuries, that the wear of a hard life and the healing of an old fracture can still be read by a bioarchaeologist bending close with the lamp. What lower ground would have dissolved into nothing, the sky preserved entire? How much of what we know of these vanished people do we owe not to their intention, but to the pitiless kindness of the air they died in? The same fist that held the bones held the paintings. Across the border, in the ruined honeycomb of Tsaparang, the murals of Guge still burn on the walls. The mineral pigments laid down by artists 9 centuries and more ago, still vibrant, still holding their colour, though the kingdom that commissioned them has been dust since the 17th century. In any temperate place, the enemy of a wall painting is moisture, the damp that breeds the mould, that lifts the pigment from the plaster, that flakes a fresco away into ruin within a few short generations. But Saparang stands in an air so arid that the moisture never comes. The mould cannot grow where there is no water to feed it. The pigment cannot flake where nothing swells and shrinks beneath it. And so the gods and the bodhisattvas and the wheel-turning kings drawn on those walls have simply waited, through the fall of the kingdom and the massacre at its foot and 4 centuries of silence, holding their colour against the day someone would climb high enough to see them. The Bon ritual objects sealed into the cave niches, the offerings tucked into the dark, the same suspension holds them, frozen in a state of perpetual waiting readiness. Is there anywhere else on this earth where the past has been so completely refused permission to rot? And where the bones and the paintings do not reach, the rock itself carries the record. The petroglyphs pecked and incised into the desert-varnished stone of the plateau, the tens of thousands of them running from Ladakh in the west to Amdo in the northeast, show a thing that ought to be impossible after so long an exposure. They show almost no weathering at all. The lines are as sharp in many places as the day the stone was struck. For weathering, too, is largely the work of water, the rain that pools and freezes and pries the rock apart, the runoff that carries the chemistry of erosion across every exposed surface in the temperate world. But on the arid plateau the rain does not fall, or falls so seldom that 1,000 years of it amounts to less than a single wet season elsewhere. The chemical erosion that would elsewhere have smoothed these carvings back into blankness never had the water it needed to do the smoothing, and so the ibex still leaps, the hunter still draws his bow, the Garuda still spreads its wings across the rock, and the oldest and most irreducible message of all, the mark that says only I was here, still says it, in lines a finger can trace, 10 centuries and more after the hand that cut them turned to dust. What other archive on the surface of the world has kept its pages this legible, this long, entirely without a librarian? This is the meaning that gathers, at the very end of the long climb, from all the scattered sites laid together on the map. The highest human civilizations that have ever existed on this earth left their whole record, their dead, their gods, their names, their signatures, in the single hardest place on the planet to reach. And the environment did not merely house that record, it suspended it, it arrested it. It held the past in a frozen readiness, refusing it the decay that is every other landscape's inevitable end, so that 3,000 years later the bones would still bear their knife marks, the walls would still hold their colour, the rock would still carry its cut lines waiting to be read. The preservation was not entirely an accident of geography. It was, in some deep sense, a choice of geography. A people who built high and buried high and painted high, in a place where only altitude could keep what they made. And whether they intended it or not, the consequence is the same, and it is severe. The record is real, and it is nearly complete, and it is legible. But it lies where it has always lain, 150 feet up a crumbling cliff, 300 meters above a river gorge, 4,000 meters and more into an air that grudges every breath. The plateau kept the highest civilization's memory whole, but it kept it behind a lock that only exertion can open. And so the archive that the sky preserved makes, in the end, a single quiet demand of everyone who would read it. It demands the climb. It gatekeeps its own history for the persistent, admitting only those willing to carry themselves up into the thin cold air where the record waits. The archaeologists with their ropes and their lamps, the conservators with their mirrors full of gathered gods, the scholars who walked the ground for 30 years to learn to see the signatures for what they were. There is a fitness in that, a symmetry that the plateau itself seems to have arranged. The people who mastered the world's most challenging environment left the proof of their mastery where nothing but that same mastery could ever retrieve it. They wrote their names in the one hand that would not fade and set them in the one place that would not let anyone lazy or comfortable or unwilling ever come close enough to read them. Perhaps that was always the condition. Perhaps the record was never meant for the traveller who wanted a paradise handed to him, the West that dreamed a Shangri-La it did not have to earn, but only for those who would do what the builders did and climb. The braided river still runs, then, in its frozen channels above the clouds. The bones still curl in the sky caves. The murals still burn on the ruined walls. The ibex still leaps on the varnished rock, and the ice above them all still holds its long calendar of the warmth that raised the kingdoms and the cold that broke them. Who owns this record is a question that men will go on fighting over on both sides of a mountain wall, with permits and archives and the machinery of nations. And the stone will not answer them, and the bones will not answer them, any more than they ever have. But the record itself is patient in a way that the quarrel is not. It has already waited 3,000 years in the highest and hardest place on earth, losing almost nothing, refusing to rot, holding its colour and its cut lines and its knife marks against every argument raised beneath it. It is not going anywhere the argument can follow, and it asks only the one thing it has always asked, that we be willing to climb. The highest human civilizations that ever were carved their memory into the roof of the world and trusted it to the cold, knowing, perhaps, what we are only now beginning to understand, that in the end the past belongs neither to the state that fences it, nor to the exile who mourns it, but to whoever loves it enough to go up into the thin bright air and look and read what has been waiting there all along,